Look everyone, it's Harudin, but wait, what's that he's hiding there? Look closer, because it's actually Harudin, a mysterious man hailing from the birth cave of an even more mysterious and foreign giant. And whilst no Elbaphian giant that we know of possesses the Will of D, there is at least one whole family of non-Elbaphian giants in the world who do. So we're going to go over Harudin's connection to this family, which I affectionately refer to as Uncle Saul, as well as Harudin's ambition and what his dream really means for the incoming dawn of the world. Hi everyone, I'm Man on the Internet, and you may remember me from videos such as This Is Why Dragon Does Nothing, where we calculated all of Dragon's on-screen appearances in One Piece and determined that his do-nothing rate was over 80%, and 12 Things You'll Wish You Never Knew About One Piece, a video which got demonetized due to the art of St. Charles I used in the thumbnail. But today I'm here to speak about something far more important than nudes of a world noble, because Harudin is rapidly becoming one of the most unexpectedly important characters in One Piece, following a path of slow graduation from Corridor Coliseum fodder to Muck Vice Puncher to Straw Hat Grand Fleet member to son of King Harold of Elbaph, and now very potentially holder of the coveted Will of D. So I don't know if this was Oda's intention from the beginning, but Harudin is getting more and more Luffy-like. Right from the get-go on Dressrosa, he did state that he wanted to become the king of the giants, and the way he recruited Road is very similar to the way that Luffy recruited most of his crew. Harudin saw Road doing a lovely drawing, thought that it was pretty cool, and said, "Let's be friends, weirdo." With Road even having the same sort of motivation to make Harudin the king of the giants as Zoro has to make Luffy the king of the pirates, although Zoro described Road's ambition as, quote, kinda boring. And in chapter 1137, Harudin is even raising his mug and exclaiming his dream in the same way that Luffy does, as if Harudin's posing for the first volume cover of his own fictional giant pirate manga. But something that goes very unnoticed about Harudin is that he's an oddity, and it's obvious just from his name, because the vast majority of Elbaph giants are named after wrestlers and have been since the very beginning. Dory and Broggy are named after Dory Funk and Bruiser Brody, which is why Broggy's weapon is called the Bruiser Axe, and Dory's sword is named the Terry Sword after Dory Funk's brother Terry. Stanson is Stan Hansen, Goldberg is Bill Goldberg, Ripley is a bit of a more modern one, being Rhea Ripley, Road comes from the Road Warriors, and even Colin is named after a wrestler, or indeed wrestlers plural, because there's a whole dynasty of Collins or whatever they are. And this even extends to giants that you've probably forgotten or perhaps never even knew existed, like Harudin's martial arts instructor Radin, named after James Radin, and he was seen during Little Garden as part of the giant warrior pirates serving under Dory and Broggy. Now, other non-wrestling based giants do exist, but their names are inspired by Norse mythology. There's the obvious in Loki, but Gerd takes her name from Gero, a Norse goddess. And then, out of nowhere, we have Harudin, who doesn't fit into either naming scheme. Harudin's namesake comes from Hayreddin Barbarossa, a former admiral of the Ottoman Navy, who was actually the younger brother of Virutrez, who was the partial inspiration for Mad Monk of Rouge. But whilst not immediately obvious to us, Harudin at his core clashes with the traditional Norse wrestling culture of Elbaph. And that makes all the sense in the world, because we now know that Harudin's mother was not from Elbaph and was in fact from another giant kingdom whose culture probably consisted of old Ottoman names and some other non-wrestling gimmick. But there is some meta context to add here, because Harudin was introduced during Dressrosa. And around this time, I suspect that Oda was doing a bit of an Ottoman deep dive, because you also have Colosseum characters like Lepanto, named after the Battle of Lepanto, and of course Suleiman, named after the longest reigning Ottoman Sultan. So there's a definite theme of what Oda appeared to be interested in at the time, and that works for throwaway characters who just need a name. But why do it for Harudin, who came from a society with an already established naming scheme? And combining that with the fact that one of the very first things Harudin said was his dream to become the king of the giants, I have to imagine that Oda already had a very strong idea for Harudin in mind, which doesn't always happen. A lot of times characters are introduced and more or less improvised into prominence, but we've also met a handful of other giants who do not have Elbaphian heritage, and their names tend to have distinctly European yet not Scandinavian influence. San Juan Wolf is a wonderful example of this. San Juan is of course the capital of Puerto Rico, but also the name of one of Japan's first Western-style sailing ships, the San Juan Bautista, meaning St. John the Baptist. And San Juan Wolf was born in West Blue, the same sea that Morley was born in, and comparing the two of them, they appear to be members of a more rotund giant civilization with very small eyes right in the center of their faces. However, Morley isn't named after anything specifically European. He's named after the Japanese word mori, meaning spear. However, his favorite food is a bagna calda, which is an Italian dish. So Harudin's mother could have been from this kingdom in West Blue, but right now I'm looking towards South Blue, to wherever Jaguar D Saul is from. And this is because Saul has something of an odd connection to Haradin. Remember that during Robin's flashback, Saul was very clear about not wanting to be associated with what he described as the savage culture of Elbaph. And yet, after the Buster Call wiped out O'Hara, Saul enlisted Haradin and the new Giant Warrior Pirates to assist in salvaging all of the books that were saved. And Dragon even goes on to describe Saul as being their, quote, captain. So there's a large degree of trust between Saul and Haradin, emanating from some sort of history that still has yet to be explained at the time of this recording. But what I would put forward is that Haradin's mother was from Saul's giant kingdom in South Blue, and if we wanted to go super conspiracy theory, then we could even pose the idea that Haradin's mother was Saul's sister, and so Haradin is Saul's nephew. And so when the O'Hara incident happened, Saul knew that there was at least one person he could trust, his own family, which is a very appealing idea to me because Saul has said that every member of his family carried the same initial D that he has, which would make Haradin the inheritor of the Will of D, which would go on to perfectly explain his similarities to Luffy and the other members of the D clan that we've encountered. And also, here's a connection that probably means absolutely nothing, but it is still there. Haradin's inspiration, Hayreddin Barbarossa. The Barbarossa part of that name is an epithet meaning red beard, and Saul's primary aesthetic trait is his big bushy red beard. I'm not going to push that too much or at all. In fact, forget that you heard it, because you can find weird connections like that everywhere in a series as big and as long as One Piece, but I'm personally not going to ignore it entirely because there's a maybe floating around here. At the very least, at some stage, Oda is going to have to explore this family of giants who inherited the Will of D. I really don't think that we're going to end this series without fleshing out this lineage, and having Haradin be the modern generation of them would be a very convenient and story relevant way to do so. And here's another thing really fun about Haradin that I think's gone a bit unnoticed. It's been hidden by the giant shroud that is Loki. When the giants were briefly going over Loki's childhood, they stated a prophecy that occurred before Loki's birth. And this prophecy stated that King Harold would be killed by his own son. And no other specifics are mentioned, but after Loki's birth, the assumption was made that it would be him, given all of the other terrible, bad alleged things that happened simply due to Loki's existence. But I see the word son and I think, that's a bit ambiguous and easily abusable for a fun plot twist. Granted, it takes a lot of mental gymnastics to somehow get Haradin involved at Harold's death at this stage, but I just want to politely leave that on the table as a point of intrigue, because the prophecy said that a son of Harold would kill the Harold, and Haradin is one of 2 confirmed people who meet that qualification, so we should not ignore him. And also on that, we don't really have a solid idea about how Haradin feels about Loki. We've been told by Road that Harold's death hit Haradin the hardest, and that he has the, quote, most cause to hate Loki for his actions. But simply having the most cause does not mean that Haradin actually does hate Loki. If anything, it makes Haradin sound very forgiving. Like, yeah, he had the most cause to hate Loki, and yet he feels not that. I wonder why. Perhaps it's because the prophecy came true and Haradin was the one responsible for killing Harold, either accidentally or because Harold may have been a very, very bad kingman. But this is information that could never become public because Haradin was already considered to have, quote, tainted blood. So having him be the one who killed the beloved King Harold would only cement Haradin as an enemy of Elbaph, much like Charlotte Linlin after she killed Yorl. But knowing that Haradin had the best interest of Elbaph in mind and would go on to become a great leader, Loki took the blame so that Haradin could unite all of giant kind and make that dream come true. And also just on this, there's a very curious event that happened during Egghead Island on Elbaph that we haven't explored yet. In chapter 1130, it was said that Haradin wanted to come to Egghead Island to help Luffy, but there was trouble happening on Elbaph, which is then implied to be Loki related. Not directly stated, but heavily implied. But then when we get to Elbaph, nothing. We arrive, Loki's still chained up, and Loki even said that he's been there for 6 years at that point, and Haradin's off elsewhere happily hunting a moose. So what happened here? The answer is I don't know. I suppose the implication may be that Haradin needed to stay on Elbaph just in case to guard Loki whilst the giant warrior pirates were away, because it was said that it took the combined strength of every giant warrior to subdue Loki after his sentence. But then again, if that were the case, then Haradin staying behind is practically pointless anyway, because most of the warriors have left for Egghead. What's Haradin gonna do? And it also makes actions like sailing to Dressrosa a bit questionable, because if Loki escaped during that time, then a missing Haradin would mean that they wouldn't have the strength needed to deal with with Loki either. So I don't know, it's just an interesting question that I'd maybe like answered. And I'd also really like to explore the relationship between King Harold and Haradin, because at the moment, on paper, they seem to have fairly opposing ideals. Haradin actually appears to follow more in Elbaph tradition than he does in Harold's beliefs of tranquil peace, as during Big Mom's flashback, we saw an 18-year-old Haradin being trained in the village, both physically and mentally, with Radin telling him, either Chief Dory or Chief Broggy will return and revive the giant pirate crew. You are a warrior. You've got to discipline yourself, Haradin. And at this time, and probably even still to this very day, Haradin also idolized Yorl and Jarl, calling them the most respected warriors of giant kind. Now, this was likely before Harold's aggressive transition to peace took place, but even then, Haradin has still carried on the traditions of Elbaph. And I think there's an increased pressure on him in particular to do so. As someone born on the island but still considered a foreign entity, it's like Haradin has to overcompensate to prove that he is worthy of being considered a warrior of Elbaph. To make up for his allegedly tainted blood, he needs to embody the traditions of Elbaph that much more potently, which sounds like it would potentially conflict with Harold's ideals for Elbaph. You've got this king who wants to take a very sharp turn away from everything that Elbaph has ever known and embrace all of this peace. But then at the same time, Haradin, his only son, was determined to become an avatar of Elbaph history and culture. It just seems like there's a clash of ideals happening between father and son there that could have led to some sort of fight and subsequent fulfillment of some prophecy. But more relevantly for this video, it's another similarity to Luffy, who's connected to several in-world prophecies at this stage, one of which being Kozuki Oden's prediction of the figures who will cause the Great War, which I guess we're now calling the Third Great War after Robin read the funky sacred text. But also Madame Charlie's prophecy that Luffy will destroy Fishman Island, which sounds bad, but apparently destroying the world is a very sun god thing to do, so maybe it's not so bad. Putting the specifics of the prophecy to one side, Haradin is a man entwined with an enhanced degree of fate, at least compared to most other characters, which is traditionally an indicator of a big old D. And in this way, you can almost see a classic One Piece twist incoming when it turns out that Haradin knew Loki was innocent all along and playing into the act for some well-written reason that I can't conjure because I am not a world-class author, but I'm thinking something along the lines of Nami in her village, with the twist that everyone knew what Nami was doing, but they were playing along because they didn't want Nami to feel bound to the village. They wanted to give her the opportunity to escape and live a decent life if she so desired. Whereas Loki's kind of the opposite. Haradin would be lying to keep him bound. And at the moment, Haradin really has only shown one Loki-related emotion, which is when Luffy was talking to Jarl and asked if Loki was a good guy, to which Haradin comically yelled, "Absolutely not," along with the rest of the giants in the area, which is evidence for the much simpler explanation that Haradin just doesn't know anything about what happened with the Harold situation, but also all of the other things that I just said. Because if Haradin doesn't know it, then he is going to find out the truth eventually, which will either cement Loki as a major antagonist or as a major ally. At the moment, I'm personally favoring the latter, and a big part of that is the theme of duality that Elbaph is currently running with. Since the very beginning when we met Dory and Broggy, the co-captains of the giant warrior pirates, to any slobby with Oimo and Kashi, to Big Mom's flashback where we met the former co-captains Yorl and Jarl, and even with Haradin and Loki, as well as the arrival of Shanks' twin brother Shamrock, we've got a very strong, enduring motif of brotherhood. If Elbaph was a sport, it would not be played alone. Elbaph is only a doubles tournament. And one way this arc could end would be with Haradin and Loki coming together and inheriting the mantle of becoming the next co-captains of the giant warrior pirates, in order to continue that proud legacy of Elbaph that both Loki and Haradin seem to believe in. Haradin wants to become king of the giants. He also wants to unite all of the giant tribes all over the world. However, this very, very greedy giant man also wants to carry on the legacy of the giant warrior pirates, which is why he founded the very creatively named New Giant Warrior Pirates in the first place, and which is why, even though Haradin is set to almost certainly become the next king of Elbaph, I don't think he'll be a stationary monarch like Vivi, Momonosuke, and all of the other people, and there's two main reasons why. The first is that he, by nature, is going to have to do a lot of traveling to fulfill his dream of uniting all of the giant kingdoms, and he can't just do that with your butt parked on a throne. But the second is that Haradin has already pledged himself as a founding member of the Straw Hat Grand Fleet, and Haradin doesn't seem like the kind of man who's going to abandon that pledge, especially after it becomes pretty damn clear that Luffy is this generation's incarnation of the sun god. And if anything, I see Haradin as as a semi-straw hat, because he has this wildly ambitious dream, but in order to make that dream a reality, he first needs Luffy to achieve his dream first. And once the barriers are broken down across the world as a result of its third destruction and rebirth, that would be the perfect opportunity to reach out to all of the other giant kingdoms and to propose a union and support each other in building a new age of very, very large prosperity. King Harold looks like a certain man. Well, not so much a man, really, because if we look at this here mirror on the wall and ask who's the owniest of them all, well, we don't know. It's a tie, because King Harold and Kaido look exactly the same. It's like Harold is Clark Kent and Kaido is Superman. Harold puts his horns back on and bam, he is Kaido. And the resemblance between Harold and Kaido isn't just, oh, they kind of look alike. It's that they look identical. And not only does this open up the question of Kaido's lineage, but it also expands on the existence of all the mysterious Oni beings dating right back to the era of war and the rise and fall of one of the planet's greatest historical villains, Oars. But first, I want to give you all a slight oven warning. When I started this channel, one of the first theory-style videos I posted was about the potential of Charlotte Oven being the son of Kaido, alongside Daifuku and Katakuri because they're triplets. But it's only Oven who displays those trademark Kaido-esque characteristics, most notably the nose and the beard. Now, this was before we knew the ages of either character, and as it turns out, Oven is 48 and Kaido is 59. So for Kaido to have been the father, he would have needed to produce Oven when he was barely 10 years old, which seems unlikely. And so I want to throw this out there because One Piece theories do have a tendency to get very tunnel visiony and ignore anything that doesn't support the initial hypothesis, such as Kaido and Harold's design features being not quite as unique as I would like to remember. But also, whilst I was reacquainting myself with Charlotte Oven, I found this picture of him in a maid outfit on Pinterest, and I don't really know what to do with this information except share it and curse all of you as well. With the Oven warning out of the way, I do want to say that the resemblance between Harold and Kaido is significant stronger, because it's not just the beard and a bitter nose. It's the beard, it is the nose, it is the eyes, it is the lips, it is all of the face. You know what? Name another body part. It's the same. And even the aura of unstable rages emanating from Harold in this portrait in the exact same way that we felt from Kaido throughout all of Wano. And Oda, he is so good at creating unique male designs. So why reuse the template from a villain we spent 4 years fighting on Wano unless there was some sort of desired connection here? But also, just to briefly point out another similar character, Harudin, confirmed son of Harold, also has a very similar facial aesthetic to Kaido, but not anywhere near the level of Harold. However, these three together do look like quite a convincing family. But man on the internet, why would King Harold have a third son? That's a good question. And it's because Harudin, he's pretty nice looking, but due to his quote, tainted blood, he was not accepted by Elbaphian society. Meanwhile, second son Loki was apparently a curse straight from birth, having killed the royal's lucky horse shortly after birth, having his mother die a year after his birth, and also coming right after a prophecy of King Harold being killed by his own son. So that's not great. That's 2 strikes, so why not try a third time, and with a different woman, because as mentioned before, Loki's mother died a year after his birth. And so a desperate King Harold, looking to cement his vision of Elbaph, tries a third time and pops out a Kaido. However, he is the most ancient giant looking of any of the brothers, so Harold sighs deeply and throws Kaido away, not wanting to deal with another Loki. Dick move. But let's talk about King Harold's goals as a king, as he was potentially seduced by the philosophy of Mother Carmel. Back when she was still Sister Carmel, she saved the lives of the remaining giant warrior pirate members by appealing to the world government at their execution. Carmel said, "Heaven seeks a peaceful understanding," and it worked. Carmel's argument was that killing the giants would only result in more violence being inflicted by angering the giants to the point of reforming the legendary army of Elbaph. "I can guide you to a brighter world where all people join hands and laugh together." And while she says this, as even a heavenly spotlight that graces Carmel conveniently at this very moment, which was of course Carmel using her devil fruit abilities. She almost certainly conjured those storm clouds with a homie, but left a little gap enough to aim a beam of light onto herself very theatrically. And if you're a giant, then mate, you would be forgiven for conflating this with a blessing of the sun god himself. For Carmel to be the only figure that the sun god chose to bathe in light at this very moment, which isn't the only time that the giants have seen Carmel Carmel as something of a sun-blessed figure. During Charlotte Lillian's hunger rampage, where she was labeled a god of disaster, Carmel conjured Pandora to consume all of the fire, saving the Elbaph village, which she then claimed was a miracle that the sun god had stepped in to save Elbaph from disaster. That's something we didn't linger on too much when this chapter was first published, but knowing everything we now know about the sun god and just how crazy integral it is to Elbaphian culture, a figure like Carmel would almost certainly command great influence just by being associated with these tangible sun god miracles. So it's absolutely no surprise to see that Carmel has apparently had enough influence to completely change the course of Elbaph as a country. And we can see that within King Harold himself. In chapter 866, Jarl mentions Carmel's ideals of being trade over plunder, which according to Ripley went on to become a memorable quote of King Harold. He used to say, "Don't fight with other countries, trade with them." Now the biggest issue is that Mother Carmel's motives were a little less than pure. So following her advice, whilst good in theory, could have led Elbaph down a very dark path. And because Mother Carmel was working for the world government, selling children and such, that may not have been her only mission with them. Carmel may also have been charged with the demilitarization of Elbaph, or the task that Figolin Shamrock has currently been entrusted with, which is having Elbaph join the world government, an entity that is itself widely known for its racism, prejudice, and even genocide against its enemies. Just ask the Lunarians or the Buccaneers. Wait, you can't ask them? Oh, point proven. I mean, there's also been historical atrocities committed against the Fishmen, but it should also be said that the giants of Elbaph also hail from one of these ancient world government enemies. What seems to have particularly scarred King Harold is a new bit of lore introduced in chapter 1137, which is the Era of War. And at the moment, we're not entirely sure if this is exclusive to Elbaph. However, it uses common language that is being used to refer to other time periods in One Piece. Right here, I should say that eras are different to ages, and it can get a bit confusing because the words era and age are kind of interchangeable in English. But for example, the One Piece timeline is currently divided into two ages, the Age of Heaven and the Age of the Sea Circle. And within those ages exist individual eras. One era that we've heard about is the previous Era of Slaves, which was a period before the Void Century, which is an era in and of itself. And I imagine it was as a result of the Era of Slaves that Joy Boy emerged to, try and change the world and put a stop to that. But those are two eras that exist within the Age of the Sea Circle. Meanwhile, we've also heard about the Era of Dinosaurs, the remnants of which we can see having survived to this day on Little Garden, which almost certainly would have been long ago during the Age of Heaven, or even a preceding age if such a thing exists. And currently, we're in what's called the Era of the Worst, which began after the death of Whitebeard and with the rise of the Worst generation. But there's a lot of unaccounted for time in the history of One Piece, particularly the time period where the ancient giants, or at least Oars, was dominant. This was about 500 to 600 years ago, and there is now some suspicion that this was the Era of War, potentially due to Oars, who was a much bigger historical deal than most people remember. So here's Gecko Moria's account of discovering Oars' corpse. "Upon finding his corpse in the land of ice, I couldn't stop trembling. I could not believe that something so fearsome wreaked havoc in the seas 500 years ago. The nations that fell at his hands were taken whole, island and everything, and he created a nation of villains. The one who created the famous legend of the Continent Puller was right before my eyes, the berserker warrior they call the Beast Oars." So Oars wasn't just some dude causing trouble in his own time. He was the Roxy Zebek of his day, the guy who was threatening to take over the entire world. And the legend of Oars is such that he's described as being far worse than Rox was, as Oars was literally stealing islands and building an empire to mount what appears to be the greatest historical challenge to the world government that we've heard of since the Void Century. And this period could certainly be worthy of being named the Era of War. And there is no doubt in my mind that whether or not the legend of Oars being a villain was true, that his reputation brought great shame to Elbaph as a result. Because anyone with ancient giant blood would have been associated with the most evil being of that time period and beyond. And taking giant lifespans into account, King Harold was almost certainly not alive during that time period, but even if he was born a couple of centuries later, the stigma, nay, the stink of Oars would still be there. Harold would have grown up in an environment where he's actively considered a villain for having horns, in the same way that Mont Blanc Cricket carried the stigma of Lion Noland, to the point where it consumed his life until he was finally able to make peace with the truth thanks to Luffy. Granted, Harold may not be directly related to Oars. I mean, he could be, but let's just assume he isn't for now. It doesn't really matter because the impact that Oars had on the world was far greater than Noland and would have resulted in far greater consequences for anyone associated with the mere visage of Oars. And the reason why I question whether or not Oars actually was a villain is because tales of historical figures are often told by unreliable narrators. The way most people in this world speak about Roger, for example, is in the same vein as Oz, as one of the most terrifying threats that the planet has ever been afflicted with. Evil incarnate and that sort of stuff. Which is also how the world government are currently trying to frame Luffy. So I don't 100% trust anything that anyone has said about Oz's personality. Because for all we know, Oz could have been the Joy Boy of his time. And this whole raising an army was his attempt to bring about the dawn of the world, which has since been shrouded in misinformation that characterizes him as a mindless, violent berserker beast. Regardless of the truth though, the existence of Oz and the heritage of the ancient giants would go on to become a very serious wedge issue on Elbaph. On one side, you've got King Harold, who was so disgusted by this heritage that he ripped off his own horns, and then you've got characters like Jarl on the other side, who in the Big Mom flashback was insistent that the giants never forget that they are warriors. And recently, Ripley has also stated that Harold got into many arguments with the village chiefs of Elbaph and their traditions, and from what we've seen so far on the island, it would appear that Harold's philosophy won in the end, but at what cost? Because after the horn ripping incident, we know that Harold is a man capable of some pretty extreme actions. It could definitely be a moment of amazing resolve that is going to go on to become an icon in One Piece history, a sacrifice he made to unite Elbaph under the banner of peace. But I could also see Harold thinking something along the lines of, every Elbaph citizen must have their horns removed or be purged for the sake of a peaceful future. Because even centuries later, the legacy of Oz, one of the world's greatest villains, still existed in those horns. And look, to some degree, that legacy was inherited by the horniest man of the modern era, Kaido. He really hasn't done a whole lot to dispel the idea of his assumed heritage, having lived and breathed war since childhood, and a man who gets legitimately depressed by a lack of conflict, often pining over Whitebeard, Roger, Rox, and Odin as if they were his ex-wives on Valentine's Day. And Kaido actually almost succeeded in becoming another Oz, because he had a plan to throw the world into a sequel to the era of war. But he also probably unknowingly followed in the path of the giants of Elbaph. It is the common dream of every giant to become the sun god, with differing takes on what the exact purpose of the sun god is, and without knowing, Kaido was pursuing the Elbaphian philosophy of the destroyer sun god, the being who will destroy the world for a third time, at least according to Elbaph myth. And Kaido said something very sun god-esque when he originally recruited King on Punk Hazard. King asked Kaido if he could change the world we live in, and Kaido replied that I'm the only one who can change it. And this has of course led to the theory that Kaido once believed that he was Joy Boy, but over time that belief dissipated and transformed into the belief that Joy Boy would be the person who defeats him. I say Joy Boy and not Nika because neither King nor Kaido have ever mentioned Nika or even the vague idea of the sun god, only Joy Boy. But however they refer to it is irrelevant because Nika, Joy Boy, and now Luffy all serve the same ultimate purpose. And in a way, Kaido is actually living out Loki's interpretation of the sun god just without the claim of godhood. And to bring this all the way back around to the world government, it may not have just been their desire to have Elbaph join them, but also to purge the planet of everyone carrying visible signs of an ancient giant. And Harold may have been convinced into this philosophy, hence ripping off his own horns. And that's just what he did to himself. If a person believes that hard, imagine what they're capable of doing to others. Which brings us to the existence of the nationless Oni race, although only Kaido has ever used this word. During his fight with Yamato, Kaido claims that Yamato was the child of Oni, and by way of existence was never meant to be friends with humans, even going so far as to say that the concept of friendship itself is a sham, and the Viz translation localizes Oni as ogres, so there Kaido says that Yamato is the child of ogres, and of course Kaido's subordinates refer to Yamato as the Oni princess. Now it's always been debatable as to whether or not the Oni actually are a separate race or if they're a hybrid, much like how Wotans are hybrids of giants and fishmen, and what really does not help at all in determining this is that none of the characters who would be considered Oni have their race listed in their entries in the Vivia card databook, which I imagine is likely due to spoiler reasons. These cards are great, but they do very purposely omit information that would spoil the series. And I think that the Occam's razor here is that the Oni are a hybrid of ancient giants. And back to Yamato, I also think that the Oni princess title is very important because it almost implies that Kaido was attempting to build a nation of Oni, and hence why so many of them have been gathered under him. Within the Toby Roper, we have Black Maria, Ulti, Page 1, Who's Who, and within the Calamities, there's also Jack. One thing to note is that Sasaki also has horns. However, this is due to him being a blue spine unicorn fishman, which are these really funky fish that have a horn. And not every horned character within One Piece necessarily has this ancient giant heritage, such as Dellinger, another great example. He's half human, half fighting fish, which are these in-world fish that have Oni-like horns. With that said, most horned characters don't have a Dellinger or Sasaki-esque explanation. So perhaps Kaido installed himself as the default king of the Oni, hence why Yamato is the Oni princess, and selecting Onigashima for this purpose, gathering a close crew of as many Oni as he could find, which would make sense with Ulti in page 1, because their history is that they were children of an unnamed pirate that Kaido knew and took in after that pirate died, which is unusually kind of Kaido, and I'd say that he was pulling a Garp, but Kaido actually ended up raising Ulti and page 1 far more thoroughly than Garp raised Ace. And in another video, I have briefly speculated that Harold could have been the father or grandfather of all of the Toby Roppo, and that Harold himself is responsible for Genghis Khaning these Oni into existence by repeatedly trying and failing to father a child to inherit his perfect vision of Elbaph. But also they could have just been the descendants of either Oars or supporters of Oars or other ancient giants throughout history. And they have followed the world government patterns, as what the world nobles seem to prefer isn't just wiping out certain races, but breaking them into servitude like we saw with Kuma, the last Buccaneer, or even Garp, a very open Will of D holder. Along the same lines, there are a couple of characters who could have ancient giant descent within the world government. The first is one we've already mentioned, being Who's Who. He was a member of CP9 and was imprisoned for life after his failure to transport the Nika fruit, which I think is quite a harsh punishment for failing a mission, but taking race into account, yeah, I can see it happening. But we've also recently met Vice Admiral Urban during the Egghead incident, who could just have a funky design, but his mouth is extremely similar to Oars and Oars Jr. I would be very, very surprised if there was no ancient giant blood there. But here is one hypothesis for how all of this happened. 500 years after the death of Oars and the end of his era, the One Piece world entered a period of great prejudice against those with ancient giant genetics. Those born with horns were considered to have inherited the evil of Oars, and this belief was eventually installed into King Harold, potentially by Mother Carmel, and Harold may or may not have then fathered Kaido and cast him aside due to said horns. But Harold wasn't necessarily going to stop there, because as we've seen, there are many, many innocent civilians on Elbaph who possess these horns. In fact, Oda has made a special point of drawing the natural horns predominantly on women and children, and if Harold was planning on purging them, then that is a very good reason to be stopped by Loki and or Jarl. Then, in order to preserve the integrity of Elbaph and all the progress they'd made, Loki took the blame, made a big fuss on the Blue Sea, was then defeated by Shanks, and today we are continuing this long-standing mission with the arrival of Gunko and Figgle Shamrock. Figgle Shamrock is the biological father of Jewelry Bonnie. Yes, we have something very special for you today. This is your classic One Piece theory, which is an idea that sounds just beyond stupid when boiled down to a single sentence like I just did, but one that has a mountain of disturbingly convincing evidence behind it. Because there is a very special connection between Jewelry Bonnie and the entire Figgle family, one that there is evidence of Oda planting all the way back in chapter 1, but not something that we properly understood until hearing the story of Ginny, which is quite a key crux here. So let's briefly examine the case of Ginny and the series of clues that Oda left behind for us in relation to her abduction. Ginny was abducted 14 years ago in a, quote, certain country, and there is some light suspicion about what this country could have been, as we do know that it was in East Blue, so it's currently suspected that it was on an island known as Kozia, which is an island that Germa 66 were contracted all the way from North Blue to attack a year after the abduction of Ginny. And notably for us, this venture is what gave Sanji his opportunity to escape and board the orbit, but Germa 66 were part of the world government and have traditionally been used as a force to quell revolutions and civil wars, such as when Ichiji and Niji were put in charge of restoring order to Brock Koli Island, which they successfully achieved in a mere 4 hours. So the timeline would go something like this. Ginny and the eastern forces of the Revolutionary Army complete a successful revolution on Kozia, and a year later, Germa 66 are contracted to bring that island back under world government control. However, Ginny, she was long gone by then. According to Mr. Dragon, Ginny was captured shortly after the success of the revolution because, quote, it seems a celestial dragon had his eye on her. She was taken on a government ship to be that celestial dragon's wife. Now, when I first read this, I didn't really think too much of it other than, because yeah, it's one of, if not the most horrible thing that could ever happen to a person, but we have seen this, how shall you call it, world noble process of wife procurement before. And it has been presented to us pass as something of a random stroke of horrendous fate. In chapter 499, St. Charles spies a nurse named Marie who's desperately trying to transport and save a dying man, but Charles takes one particularly hebetudinous look at her and claims that he will take her back to Marijois and make her his 13th wife, but not before getting rid of wives 1 through 5, which Charles had grown tired of, and said to, quote, return them to the rabble. So this is a pretty horrifying scene on its own, but it gets a lot worse once you realize that this was the foundation for Jewelry Bonnie, who's actually in this scene, by the way. When Zorro attempts to cut Charlos's infinite layers of fat, Jewelry Bonnie reverts to what we now know is her true form and saves him by pretending that Charlos shot and killed Zorro. And in retrospect, this chapter is a work of disturbing genius, because not only does it reveal Bonnie's true form right in front of our eyes without us realizing, but what Charlos did here is exactly what happened to Bonnie's mother, Ginny. And it would be a further 2 years before Bonnie learned the truth, but what she witnessed here was a replaying of what happened with her mother. And what really, and I mean really, twists the knife of tragedy into that story gut is that Bonnie played a part in making it happen. She stopped Zorro from attacking Charlos, and without knowing it, Bonnie essentially condemned Marie to the same fate as her mother. Right down to the fact that Ginny was eventually released and, quote, returned to the rabble once the world nobles were through with her. So this sort of thing is very common in world noble society. However, the Ginny and the eventual Bonnie situation is very uncommon. St. Charles was able to wife hunt because Sabadi Archipelago is an accepted tourist hotspot for world nobles, but when Ginny was abducted, she was on a Revolutionary Army battlefield in East Blue, which is not a sea frequented by world nobles in general unless on official business, like St. Jalmac's visit to the Goa Kingdom as a diplomat. World nobles they do not go to East Blue for their surface holidays because there's nothing for them to see or do there. It's a very boring sea. And it's also heavily implied that Ginny's abduction was the result of a strategic operation. The report that Dragon went through mentioned that the Revolutionary Army were caught completely unaware. They were ambushed by a world noble who would have needed to be far more confident than your average bumbling St. Charles. So this wasn't a case of a world noble going wife shopping and wandering around. Nah. Ginny was likely targeted in advance, and further intelligence reported to Dragon stated that this particular celestial dragon had had his eye on her. And this world noble is the man who would likely become the biological father of Jewelry Bonnie. But again, this is very unusual, and it means that whoever abducted Ginny needed a particularly strong motive to do so. Much stronger than, hey, there's a pretty nurse over there, let's make her wife number 13. And I think this is also evident in how much Ginny suffered during her time at Marijois. I don't think that any world noble wife or slave, or I guess it's kind of both, realistically has a fantastic time in the company of the world nobles, but what happened to Ginny was especially cruel, almost as if she was being punished for something, which could definitely be the case, because while she was alive, Ginny was one of the greatest enemies of the world nobles. Not only was she a Revolutionary Army member, which is pretty bad on its own, but Ginny was almost single-handedly responsible for orchestrating the God Valley incident, one of the greatest stains on world government history, and Ginny did this by broadcasting the Devil Fruit prizes for the native hunting competition. And the world government 100% held a grudge against her for doing that, just like they did with Kuma. During the God Valley incident, a young Bartholomew Kuma was unfortunate enough to cross paths with Saint J. Garcia Saturn of the 5 Elder Stars, and while Kuma did escape that day, Saint Saturn never forgot this, and he vowed to slowly and methodically destroy Kuma. So I don't think it's out of the question that they may harbor a similar distaste for Ginny, who was far more responsible for this incident than Kuma was. An incident which was a particularly deep stain for two parties, one being Saint Saturn and the 5 Elders, as Saturn was overseeing the competition, and the other would be the Holy Knights themselves, who were in charge of protecting the world nobles during the contest, as well as participating in it. And for quite some time, it was highly suspected that Bonnie's biological father was actually Saint Saturn itself, because it just made sense, as Saturn was the one responsible for experimenting on Ginny and giving her the Sapphire Scales disease, and Saturn's motivation to abduct Ginny would have been twofold. Firstly, to torment Kuma, which is an act that has taken up a large part of Saturn's attention for the past half a century, but secondly, to punish Ginny for what she did on God Valley. Saturn, being the father, would have wrapped up everything in this neat little package, but apparently Oda has other plans. Because right after the Kuma flashback ended, Saturn revealed that yes, he had experimented on Ginny, but only after she was discarded by a, quote, fellow in the Holy Land. And Saturn also said that Ginny was this fellow's 8th wife, which I don't think is just superfluous information. It shows that Saturn knew this man well enough to keep track of his wife count, which I imagine could be exceedingly difficult in world noble society if St. Charles is was anything to go by. The dude got rid of 5 wives in one day. So things changed too quickly within the less relevant members of the world nobles. I certainly wouldn't sit down to keep track of Charles's wives. But either way, St. J. Garcia Satin is confirmed to not be the father. And maybe it was another Elder Star? But that's not as narratively strong of an idea as a member of the Holy Knights, as other than St. Satin, they were the faction most shamed by Ginny. And if we're talking about biological parentage, which we are, the video is exclusively about that, then Bonnie does bear a strong resemblance to 2 members of the Holy Knights. However, we do need to reach this point via a rather unconventional path. And that road would be when Oda was asked to draw the worst generation members as if they'd been gender swapped by Emporio Ivankov, which gave us a lot of cute and funny drawings of everyone. Here we have Capone Gang Babe, Trafalgar, and Scratch Women Apu, among others, many others, with one of those others being Bonnie, who when swapped is apparently a carbon copy of Shanks or Shamrock, or even a young Figerland Garling now. And yes, I should say this was drawn as a gag, but in One Piece, jokes can and often do go on to become real, such as in the SBS of Volume 61. A reader commented on Sanji's eyebrow because the curl had seemingly changed positions between pre and post time skip, which we now know is just because Sanji was showing his other eye, where the eyebrow was just naturally like that. But the reader suggested that this was either a drawing mistake by Oda, or that this was not in fact Sanji and was actually his twin brother Yonji. And this was published in February 2011, 5 whole years before Sanji's twin brother Yonji was officially introduced and became a genuinely kind of important dramatic plot point. I don't want to overstate Yonji's importance, it wasn't much, but he was there. Or for something completely Oda-centric, there was that one time where he drew the Wado Ichimonji personified in a fun, wacky face, which went on to be the design of Shimotsuki Kozaburo, the man who made the Wado. So just because something is a gag doesn't mean that it can be completely dismissed from relevance, not in One Piece. I mean, right now in Yamato's cover story, we're trying to solve the mystery of the missing Minatomo, the twin brother of a character who was invented by Oda in an SBS to explain a continuity error in the very first chapter of One Piece. So these jokes do become real to varying degrees. And while this is far from confirmation that Bonnie is in any way related to the Figerland family, it is one point on a data set that supports that conclusion. One of many to come. Because another point is Bonnie's fictional real-world nationality. And this is a concept that can be a bit confusing and is, as far as I'm aware, almost exclusive to a wacky series like One Piece. But the One Piece characters in world also have real-life nationalities that they would be if they existed in the real world. The classic example of this is Luffy, who would be Brazilian, or Sanji, who would be from France. And if you were curious about Jinbei, then he would be from India. And the list goes on and on and on. And admittedly, this is usually fairly irrelevant to the story, but sometimes we do find very interesting connections based on these designations. Figerland Shamrock is a prime example of this, a very Irish name which is very in keeping with his brother Shanks. And there's even an Irish coat of arms for the Shanks family, with a lot of elements generally representing majesty, justice, military honor, and protection of Providence. Providence being an influence that is not human in origin and is said to control people's lives. Stuff like fate and destiny, but also perhaps like an inhuman shadow demon secretly in charge of the entire planet, with this whole family crest fitting a bit too perfectly into the lineage of the Holy Knights that the Figerland family have created. And not only that, there is evidence to suggest that Oda had Irish Shanks in mind right from the beginning of One Piece. What you're seeing on screen right now is one of Oda's earliest maps of East Blue, which you can see sits right above the Gland line. Oda actually made a map of the entire world back in the very early days so that at least he would know where he was going, and a lot of that has changed over time, including this beautiful little nugget that was noticed by Dawn and Dusk on Twitter, a curious location north of Fuchsia Village called Yotsuba Island, which is notable in this case because Yotsuba means 4-leaf clover and is therefore even more Irish than Shamrock because Shamrock is only 3 leaves. And Shanks himself may have stated a connection to this island all the way back in chapter 1. Shanks said that he'd been using Fuchsia Village as a base for about a year, and after 2 or 3 more voyages he was gonna leave for good and head north, with the only thing marked by Oda as being north of Fuchsia Village at the time being Yotsuba Island. So Irish Shanks was heading to the Irish island. Perhaps back in the early days of One Piece, this was where Shanks originated from before Oda came up with the God Valley story. But this is now becoming my favorite kind of One Piece theory. The kind where all of the evidence, if you look at it individually, is outlandish and unlikely. But when you piece it all together, it starts to form a pretty undeniable pattern. One that is, at the very, very least, an astonishing coincidence. So if Jewelry Bonnie was Irish as well, I say as well, very importantly, neither Shanks nor Shamrock have had their real-world nationalities revealed by Oda yet, but I would be beyond shocked if they were not Irish. And so if Bonnie had an Irish connection as well, then that is another point in the dataset. Bonnie's nationality, however, has been revealed, and she, like me, is Australian. The only Australian in One Piece, with the exception of Mino Koala, who, yes, I will claim as our own. Our koalas are endangered, and we simply do not have enough of them to give them away to serve as prison guards. So no luck there, but look, one can be both Irish and Australian, case in point. And Bonnie actually has an even greater claim to Irishdom than I do. Jewelry Bonnie was inspired by the real-life pirate Anne Bonny, who was allegedly Irish, although it's heavily disputed. A General History of the Pirates by Charles Johnson claims that she was born in Cork, but there's no record to back this up, and the author is assumed to have taken a lot of creative license with this history of all these pirates. That really doesn't matter for us though, because we are not real-world pirate historians. Nah, we are fictional pirate historians. And this book, A General History of the Pirates, comes up a lot when digging into One Piece, as many of its figures and events have inspired One Piece characters, and it is quite clear that this is one of the core pieces of literature that Oda read when researching for One Piece. So even if Anne Bonny wasn't Irish in real life, that doesn't matter if Oda read this book and thinks that she was. However, I do also think that this theory has ignored one very strong possibility to date, because I've been focusing a lot on Mr. Figgle Shamrock, because he's our shiny new toy with a fun doggo accessory, where its head comes off and swords come out, and it's all very cool. But I think that Old Man Figgle and Garling is at this stage an equally as horrifying possibility, because the thing about Shamrock, right, is that he doesn't have as strong of a personal vendetta for the God Valley incident because he was just a baby. However, Figgle and Garling was very much involved, and not only did the incident soil the pride of the Holy Knights, but it also resulted in one of Garling's children being abducted and raised by pirates. Garling has such a strong motivation to enact what he would believe to be justice and retribution on those responsible for God Valley, and as we've explored, no one is more responsible than Ginny. So while Saint Saturn focused on Kuma, Garling could have directed his attention to Ginny, keeping track of her and deciding that the revolution in East Blue was the ideal time to strike and cause Ginny to suffer an unimaginable fate, which would definitely give Dragon a very strong motivation to beat Garling on behalf of Kuma, as Dragon has cited the Holy Knights as the greatest obstacle to the Revolutionary Army succeeding. So that appears to be seeding their eventual conflict. In whatever massive final war battle ends up happening, the Straw Hats are likely going to be busy fighting on the pirate front against Blackbeard and a couple of other emperors, whilst the Revolutionary Army would be the ones targeting the world government. And it really would give a bit more oomph to that potential Dragon Garling fight. Although I guess it would also make Shanks Jewelry Bonnie's older brother, Shamrock, as well. But having said all of this, I do think it's possible that the answer will never be revealed. It's quite a big decision for any author to outright label one of their characters as an R word I can't say on YouTube. And even though the events are undeniably implied, most of the time Oda will avoid specifics as much as possible, because those specifics do end up tainting characters. And Saint Don Quixote Moscard is always my go-to example of sterilizing characters. He was a world noble who kept both slaves and wives, but Oda made sure never to show any of this or the results of Moscard's horrendous actions. And that is what allowed him to become palatable and redeemable to the readers. It's the kind of thing you cannot do with, say, Saint Charles, because we've seen him do far too much, even though realistically he's probably no different to how Saint Moscard used to act. And I know that Garling and Shamrock are designed to be antagonists, so we're not supposed to like them, but even antagonists need to be likable in their own way in a shonen manga, so it would be quite risky if either Garling or Shamrock ended up being directly responsible for the Ginny situation. But if they were, then it's possible that Jewelry Bonnie's story is far from over, and that she'll have a multi-arc story as a Straw Hat companion, much like Vivi, Kinemon, and Momonosuke did. Elbaph has become Hellbaph, as anything the human mind is capable of imagining is coming into existence on this island. And the reason why this is happening is because conjuring nightmares is now the only way of combating Luffy's ability to tangibly manifest his dreams and imagination. One Piece has well and truly left the realm of what once passed for reality, but the future of Elbaph, and in fact the future of the world, isn't just in Luffy's hands, and Elbaph is going to be the first of many islands to experience an awakening, and before this arc is over, we could see an army of giant sun gods. Late stage One Piece has very much become a fight on the battleground of dreams. Although the entire premise of the series has always been a dream, it's even quite literally stated in the opening of almost every episode. Wealth, fame, power. Gold Roger, the king of the pirates, attained this and everything else the world has to offer, and his dying words drove countless men to the seas. You want my treasure? You can have it. I left everything gathered together in one place. Now you just have to find it. These words lured men to the Grand Line in pursuit of dreams greater than they'd ever dared to imagine. And some of those men and not men are the Straw Hats, with each of them having their own dreams, such as becoming the Pirate King, drawing a map of the world, curing all disease, finally seeing some panties after almost a century of asking politely, and so on and so forth. Our protagonists all have these wildly ambitious dreams to achieve, as does almost everyone who we meet along the way. Kobe wants to become a Marine Admiral, Sambo wants to become an author, and Hard-chan wants to start a cannibalistic takoyaki stand. And everyone closely connected to the ancient Great Kingdom has even bigger ambitions. The fishmen dream of living on the surface, the people of Wano want to open the borders, the minks are waiting for the dawn of the world, and also our antagonists even dream. Which is why One Piece has a focus on what I call dream combat, which is why Luffy doesn't kill his opponents. He instead shatters their dreams and ambitions, leaving them without the will remaining to be pricks anymore, at least for the most part. And really, Luffy tends to fight two kinds of people: those who dream and those who have dreamed but said dreams have been shattered. Most pre-time skip antagonists fall into that latter bucket. Luffy faces off against a lot of individuals who have tried and failed, like Kuro, Don Krieg, Arlong, Crocodile, and Gecko Moria. Although there are a couple who dream big, like Enel and Spandam, as well as some who have never dreamed at all and have accepted their place as a function of society, such as Rob Lucci. Either way, pre-time skip, what Luffy was coming up against most was wall after wall of denial. He was facing off against those who have failed or those who had never tried and therefore could not accept that Luffy could succeed either. However, post-time skip is a very different beast altogether, because in the new world, dreaming is a prerequisite for survival. You cannot make your way through this sea without that strong mentality. And so Luffy has now been fighting directly against antagonists who are trying to manifest their own dreams, however nightmarish they may be. We're talking people like Hody Jones, Caesar Clown, Doflamingo, Bigagamam, Kaido, and even Damalo Black, the fake Luffy who had a dream of entering and conquering the new world. And that's before we mention the truly heavy hitters who we still have yet to defeat, such as Blackbeard and Sakazuki, who both have the horrifying capacity to render their dreams into reality, which to many would be more accurately referred to as nightmares. And the very nature of the One Piece world itself is kind of like a dream, in that it makes sense in the context of the dream, but not when you try to talk about it while you're awake. Because how do you explain a dream that contains giant zombies, dinosaurs, cyborgs, secret agents, mermaids, cake islands, men in boxes, and men in chicken butts? You can't. It just doesn't make sense. One Piece is a dream. But with dreams also comes the existence of nightmares. Oda created the Grand Line and the New World as an opposing force to hope. The despair of this impossibly chaotic sea is meant to be a direct challenge, to meet impossibly high dreams with an equally as tough obstacle, and he said that he created this space to shock both the characters and the audience. So One Piece is a half dream, half nightmare being brought into existence by Eiichiro Oda. However, in the final saga, we've taken this concept a big step further. And now dream power is quite tangible and shockingly literal. The idea of manifesting one's dreams isn't just to push and take small steps towards achieving a tangible goal. No, now we have Luffy's power in Gear 5th. Luffy at his most liberated, with his imagination completely uninhibited, free to do what I think is quite literally anything he wants to do. In his Gear 5th form, Luffy is a living dream. If he can imagine it, then it becomes real. And it's also a power that he's passing on to those around him, like some sort of dreamer's disease. A disease caught by one Jewelry Bonnie, which is appropriate, because her entire childhood was characterized by a disease called sapphire scales, a nightmarish condition conjured from the mind of actual demon St. J. Garcia Saturn. And that right there is the other side of introducing dreaming as a tangible unapproachable power source. It has to come with an opposing force for the sake of tension. Otherwise, One Piece would drop drama altogether and just become a gag manga. But just like how Eiichiro Oda created the Grand Line as an opposing nightmarish force to challenge the dreams of his characters, in the final saga, the idea of literally manifesting nightmares has become terrifyingly real through multiple different vehicles. Most recently, the Holy Knights have shown their capacity to put children to sleep and bring their worst fears into reality, whether that be a Fenrir, a Jormungandr, a Loki, this kid's mum, or even the fear of the sun god himself. What we are dealing with on Elbaph is a challenge based in hypotheticals rather than any sort of fictional reality, which is usually where our protagonists excel. Remember that pre-time skip, our characters constantly ran into wall after wall of boring reality that they had to demolish through the sheer willpower of dreaming. And it's that power that's being used against us in the final saga, which I think is perfectly demonstrated in the examples of both Loki and Nika, because they do exist in reality, but we're not fighting against what it is they actually are. We're going up against the worst case scenario perception of what Nika and Loki are capable of, with one being prophesized to destroy the world and the other who has been self-prophesized to also destroy the world. Nika is understandable because there's a lot of history attached to the sun god, and it is quite historically unclear whether he's a figure that we should embrace or fear. Loki, however, is a modern legend of Elbaph, and it's very possible that what we're seeing of his nightmare conjuration is exactly what Loki was trying to portray himself as. If for whatever reason his destroy the world attitude is all an act to protect Elbaph, what his nightmare incarnation shows is how successful he's been in conjuring and maintaining that act. And perhaps the choice that Loki himself will have to make during Elbaph is whether he chooses the path of dream or nightmare. The nightmare theme isn't new to Elbaph though, and Oda explored this quite thoroughly on Egghead Island through Jewelry Bonnie. Saint Saturn was her nightmare. He experimented on Bonnie's mother, butchered her father, and pursued her all the way to this point as a giant demonic spider. And so Bonnie's challenge on Egghead Island was to overcome that nightmare through the hope of dreaming, and also to become liberated from a nightmare imposed on her by someone else. And if you weren't reading weekly at the time, Bonnie being able to use her devil fruit to achieve the Gear 5th Nika form did generate some criticism from those who claimed that it cheapened Luffy's achievement to have the form accessed by a 12-year-old girl. But the point of Oda doing this was less about transforming and power and punching, but more about showing that Bonnie was finally free of her lifelong nightmare. And I think that a similar thing could be about to happen on Elbaph, which I imagine would generate similar controversy, because I'm not sure if these nightmare creatures can be fought and destroyed through the efforts of real-life willpower alone, because that's not usually how nightmares work. Just like dreams, nightmares are usually illogical, like the classic one of being chased and you're trying to get away but your legs, they just won't move. Why legs? Why are you doing this? Or trying to flee through a small space that gets progressively more narrow until you get stuck? Or suddenly being naked in public? Nightmares are not logical, and so they could have access to the same Toon-esque abilities that Luffy has, which would be the answer to how an opponent successfully combats Luffy from here on out. I love Gear 5th, but it's a very risky ability to balance, as no opponent since Luffy having achieved this form has been able to give him a serious challenge. And I very much include Kaido in that. After Gear 5th was activated, Kaido fought and fought. He hit and he hit, and he even became a giant scary fire dragon, but in the end, nothing even came close to breaking Luffy's liberation. It was extremely one-sided, but well choreographed and very fun to read one-sided, because Kaido was not equipped to deal with Luffy. And that makes sense because he's a very reality-based man. He had the title of World's Strongest Creature, which, yeah, it's probably true, but when you have a title that defined, it grounds you in the reality of that title. It doesn't allow you to have the belief that you can push further because you're already the strongest. There's nowhere left to go, which is why Kaido was often seen drinking in despair and had a hobby of seeing if he could remove himself from the world because there was no dream to move towards. In the end, Kaido settled for a goal of starting the biggest war that the world has ever known, but that feels like more of a resignation than it does a goal. The idea that this world has nothing left to offer, so I may as well just get rid of it. But children don't have that level of despair. They have yet to grow up, experience the ceilings of the world, and give in to them, which is what makes using the nightmares of the children of Elbaph extremely effective. Because what can any adult do? All of the adults are too grounded in reality to defeat creatures that aren't subject to the rules of reality, which is why I think that it may be up to the children of Elbaph themselves to ultimately save the island. Just as it was up to Jewelry Bonnie to free herself from the nightmare of Saint Saturn. Yes, Luffy was there to help and inspire her, just as he will be there to help and inspire the children of Elbaph, who actually have one key advantage over Bonnie, which is that they culturally are taught to believe that any one of them can become the sun god. Bonnie was raised with the idea that Nika was an external force, someone who would eventually come and liberate you from your chains. So there were a few extra steps in getting Bonnie to awaken the Nika power for herself. But the end of the Elbaph arc could see every child on this island accessing the Gear 5th form and awakening like Bonnie did. Perhaps not physically themselves, but if Luffy is able to instill enough hope and joy into them, maybe through fighting and clowning on the nightmare creatures, then the nightmares of the children would vanish in the face of hope. And in their place, they could imagine each and every one of themselves becoming Nika, and then create an army of Nika to overwhelm the Holy Knights using their own ability. And there's some seeding for this already, as in chapter 1136, there is a very sneaky piece of art that a lot of people missed during the feast in the village, which is on this page, where at the very bottom you can see a Colin in the trademark Nika pose, perhaps foreshadowing that he's next to take on the sun god form. Oda doesn't just draw these things randomly, and I should also say that Oda purposely drew Loki in the other trademark Gear 5th pose as well in that very same chapter, so we have the potential for multiple sun god awakenings on Elbaph. If anyone was gonna do it first though, I currently most strongly believe in Colin. I would love it if he fell under the nightmare spell and had so much hope and spirit that he conjured a dream instead of him in the Nika form, which could go on to inspire the other children to see that in themselves. Or if not themselves, maybe the children could dream of their parents as sun gods. Yes, even that kid's mum could have a Nika form, and we would then have an army of fully grown sun godified giants for the Holy Knights to deal with. But look, why am I putting so much stock in Colin and the Elbaph children? It seems like a weird thing to focus on when we've got this wonderful shiny Loki right over there. But the reason why I'm focusing on the kids is because of Oda's focus and the legacy that he wants to leave on the world. In an interview with live action Luffy and Yaki Godoy, Oda was asked how he came up with Luffy, and the reply was, "Luffy is an ideal child for me. When you become an adult and join a company, you can't always do what you want. Entering society often means losing freedom. Luffy has a child's heart, so he does whatever he wants. That aspect is probably for adults already toiling in society, and to children about to enter society, what makes Luffy so appealing." So from the very beginning of One Piece, Oda has had a serious focus on the inherent freedom present within the mind of a child. And that's why Luffy has that mind which cannot ever be constrained or restrained. But it's also why Oda constantly chooses children to be the emotional focal points of his arc, especially post-time skip with Shirahoshi, Rebecca, Tama, Momonosuke, Jewelry Bonnie, and now Colin, as well as the rest of the kids on Elbaph. And Oda generally imparts part of Luffy onto these characters, usually in the form of an important lesson or mental fortitude, but starting with Bonnie, he is completely liberating them and turning them into the ideal children that he sees Luffy as. With Bonnie, I think this may be a response to Oda having two daughters. He's been drawing One Piece for almost 30 years, so he's grown and matured. And what we have to remember is that Oda is definitely someone who saw himself as Luffy when he first started drawing One Piece at almost the exact same age that Luffy was. As the earliest Luffy we have is the concept of Monkey D. Pow, drawn for a rejected manga called Forward in 1994 when Oda was 19 years old. And Luffy is now 19 years old in the One Piece world. However, Oda himself, back in reality, he has aged, he has matured, and now his focus is less on Luffy and more on the next generation. He knows that Luffy's story is coming to an end, but Oda wants to make sure that his spirit endures and leaves a mark on this world. So with Bonnie, I think that's a direct message to Oda's daughters that they are also capable of pursuing their dreams. And so on Elbaph, I think we may see that concept applied on a much wider scale with the children, and the message that everyone can achieve their dreams. Not easily, mind you. In both this and the case of Bonnie, it requires being able to fight through the nightmares, but it can be done. And I do think this will remain the overall trajectory of One Piece from here until the end of the series, especially considering that Blackbeard and Emu are both set up to be ultimate nightmares to overcome. Emu has long been thought to be a silhouette, but perhaps he is just a nightmare creature. Perhaps what we're seeing is just him. This is the true form of his power. Like the true form of Luffy's ability is a dream cartoon man that can't possibly exist in reality, even if it is fictional reality. And then Blackbeard is somehow even more terrifying because he's very much the anti-Luffy, but also someone man who is very capable of dipping into the same power source as Luffy, a man blessed by fate, fueled by dreams, and who himself has caused Luffy's biggest nightmares in the series by being responsible for capturing Ace. And with the abilities of a Darkness Logia, you'd better believe that everything we're seeing on Elbaph right now is gonna look very cute compared to the nightmare that Blackbeard brings to the sleep table, and that the final challenge to enact the dawn of the world will be to overcome the concept of darkness itself. Gunko is the owner of a very ironic devil fruit ability that allows her to cement the future. Once conjured, these arrows become destiny. But perhaps unbeknownst to Gunko, her character is being led by the narrative arrow of Eiichiro Oda. And it's being led in a very familiar and well-explored direction, as Gunko is almost certainly going to become the latest in a long line of beautiful female antagonist to beautiful female protagonist characters. I really cannot stress enough just how common this is. So much so that there's been at least one of this character archetype in every post-time skip arc since Dressrosa. Almost immediately after setting foot on Dressrosa, we meet a gladiator named Rebecca, who many people forget was briefly and originally an antagonist. Rebecca conspired to kill Luffy by luring him into a fiendish trap, and it was for a pretty cold reason as well. No one was forcing Rebecca to do this like how Bellamy was ordered to kill Luffy. Nah. Rebecca did this of her own volition because she knew that Luffy was powersome and that eliminating him quietly in the shadows would increase her chances of winning the Mera no Mi. So this was a bit of a speed run of this concept. We went from enemy to ally very quickly after Rebecca failed, but at the same time we had the same concept happening elsewhere on Dressrosa with Viola seducing Sanji, and she turned out to be a member of the Don Quixote family. So she was a genuine enemy, unlike Rebecca, who you could argue was just doing what she had to do in order to survive. Instead, Viola was much more of a direct antagonist. However, she flipped quite quickly as well after Sanji yelled that he would never doubt a woman's tears, after which point Viola used her literal tears to defeat all of her minions, so I shan't doubt them either. And as it turned out, she was actually a former member of Riku royalty and wanted to liberate this island from the Flamingo. Then next up we have Whole Cake Island, which is probably the best explored incarnation of this concept to date. Charlotte Pudding was again introduced as an ally, but then was actually an enemy, but then became a mostly ally once again thanks to Sanji. And this trend would of course continue into Wano, as Kozuki Hiyori was originally presented to us as the cold-hearted Komurasaki, a woman who makes a living by seducing men, sucking them dry in every way except the one it is they want, leaving them destitute and doing it all with the cute catchphrase of, "I have only scorn for the poor man." It's such a cold catchphrase. And the names of three of the men that she did this to were Bingo, Bongo, and Bungo. Bungo was an arsonist, then Bongo would price gouge the people whose houses burnt down thanks to Bungo, and Bingo would make money off the funeral of those who died in Bungo's fires. So Hiyori/Komurasaki didn't target just regular people. These three very much deserved everything that was done to them and more. But we didn't know that at the time. To us, it looks like Komurasaki was just taking advantage of some very unfortunate men. And initially, she's also presented to us as an ally of Orochi, someone who's more than happy to entertain his affections. And Komurasaki was so infamously evil that people were actually concerned for Orochi's well-being, which is wild, but that is the facade that Hiyori and Denjiro built up with the Komurasaki persona. And as per usual, that all breaks down. Komurasaki does an immediate about-face and becomes a much more standard Oda woman in distress. And one very common trait that all of these women share is that they lead fake lives, generally to put up a strong exterior to protect their inevitably fragile selves. And on Egghead Island, Stussy follows in that path as well, having been introduced twice as a villain, once as an underworld emperor, and then as a member of CP0, before finally settling in as an ally of Vegapunk and the Straw Hats with a strong emotional desire. And you know what? You might even be able to throw Lilith in there. She was an antagonist for all of one chapter, so I don't know if I really count her, but I guess you could. Either way, this is a pattern that's very difficult to ignore post-time skip. With the exception of Zoe and the Reverie arc, every arc from Dressrosa onwards has featured at least one classically beautiful Oda woman who initially stands against us, only for her to switch sides and join the ever ever-growing Straw Hat harem. And I should say that this precedent isn't exclusive to post-time skip One Piece. It's just that in the post-time skip, this device gets used a lot more than in pre-time skip. But Nami, Vivi, and Robin, three very core Straw Hat members, were all antagonists at some point turned allies, as was Boa Hancock much later on. So if Oda does introduce a pretty-some woman, chances are she's already on the road to redemption, which we can even see with more side characters like Perona. Although there are notable exceptions to this. Califa from CP9 is a pretty big one. She had all of the essential ingredients to flip, but has remained an antagonist, as did Monet on Punk Hazard until she came to the end of her life, having her heart viciously stabbed by a maniacal clown. And most recently on Wano, Black Maria is also a pretty standout example. Although that may be cancelled out by Ulti essentially becoming an ally now as well. And I'll also say that Egghead Island featured York doing the exact opposite of our trope as well. She was an ally and then turned into what I imagine is a very permanent enemy. So there are exceptions. The system is not infallible. But the general trend and consensus is that beautiful female villain tends to become beautiful female not villain. Which brings us to Gunko on Elbaph. Because while nothing is guaranteed, each passing chapter makes it harder for me to believe that she will remain as an antagonist. Despite being a holy knight, Oda is going to some pretty interesting lengths to keep Gunko separated from the concept of world nobility. Every other holy knight on Elbaph so far has been accompanied by an introduction box confirming their sainthood and stating their family connection. Saint Figaland Shamrock, Saint Remo Shifu Gillingham, and Saint Shepherd Summers, who's particularly interesting because he's from the same family as Elder Star Saint Shepherd Jupiter. However, Gunko's introduction box by comparison is incredibly bare, just stating Holy Knight Gunko, effectively confirming that she is not a world noble. And I do think that her words to Loki give us some insight into her potentially very interesting heritage. When attempting to recruit Loki to the Holy Knights, Gunko states, "A member of the common rabble receiving a chance to join the ranks of gods is a miracle one can only dream of. And we are offering you that miracle now." And so I would suspect that Gunko herself was a member of the quote common rabble who was offered the chance to join the ranks of gods. An elevation of status that she authentically considers to be a miracle. And that's why she can't understand Loki refusing the offer. I feel like many full world nobles would treat Loki like more of an animal, that they're offering him a better chance, but his existence, it's too stupid and inferior to process it. Like offering a dog $1,000. Mate, the dog could do a lot with that kind of money, but it doesn't know what or how or what the money represents. It's a dog. Gunko doesn't have that mindset though. She's able to identify with these lower class commoners. Disgusting. And Oda has kept her very mentally distinct from her world noble associates. One very subtle thing Oda did in chapter 1143 was when we see Gunko, Killingham, and Summers having a delightful afternoon tea on Elbaph, and Oda focuses on the contrast of how Saint Summers eats versus how Gunko eats. With Summers, we have a close-up of a very arrogantly drawn man stuffing his face with food that he believes he's entitled to. There's nothing special about this experience to Saint Summers. It's expected that he consumes only the finest of delicious dream dinners each and every day. But then we see Gunko eating the same food, and she's amazed by how good it tastes. It's so good that it's having a physical effect on Gunko, even making her blush a little. It's a very humble expression of the joy that food can bring someone, none of which is present in the panel of Saint Summers eating. And many people may think that I'm reading far too much into this, but mate, this is a much bigger deal than you think. Because Oda uses this food contrast quite a bit to indicate someone's general sense of right and wrong. And what Gunko reminds me of is Tama's reaction to tasting Kiku's Oshiriko during early Wano. There was something so extremely innocent, heartwarming, yet tragic about Tama exclaiming that she never knew that food could be this good. It's so good that it makes Tama grateful that she's even alive, just so that she could have this experience of tasting it. Meanwhile, to those who occupy the world noble equivalent positions on Wano, the Beast Pirates, they take Oshiriko for granted. So much so that they purposely spill it because it doesn't go well with their drinks. Now, Saint Summers doesn't go that far, but we have that same dynamic of entitlement versus gratitude. Even though it's dream food and it gives us no nutritional benefits, Gunko is still so grateful to have tasted it. And while I wouldn't bet the 1,000 Sunny on this factor alone, Oda is very purposeful in defining characters through their relationships with food. Whenever someone's eating, you can tell everything you need to know about them just by observing that action, which is why we usually have a big banquet at the end of arcs, so that all of our very, very good characters can be shown at their absolute purest and happiest. So the visual language of One Piece to date is telling me pretty powerfully that Gunko should have a decent heart. We'll see if that goes on to be true, but that's not all. As the role Gunko currently inhabits on Elbaph is also very closely tied to the history of storytelling in general, most prominently in the theater. In ancient Greek and Roman comedy plays, there is an established dynamic of the exceptionally smart slave/servant and the bumbling master, which is a dynamic that persisted all the way to Shakespeare. Many of his plays feature the lower status characters being the wiser individuals, and it's something that you still see to this very day. I guess a more modern example of this would be the intelligent salary worker and the incompetent office manager. That is the role that Gunko seems to fill at the moment. As far as we're aware, Shamrock has left her on Elbaph with St. Summers and St. Killingham, each of them possessing far higher status than Gunko, but both of them also possess heavily detrimental comedic qualities that seem to mentally exhaust her. And it's very much the responsibility of Gunko to stay on track here. She's the one that says we shouldn't ignore the presence of Luffy, dude's an emperor after all, and she's also the one to flag a fear of Nika. And Gunko also gets actively annoyed at St. Summers especially, and I think that's because he doesn't live up to what her belief of a world noble should be, which is unfortunate because St. Summers is perfectly representative of your average world noble, and Gunko has shown no interest in the way that he and other nobles entertain themselves. And in fact, Gunko has even shown an active distaste for it. In chapter 1143, St. Summers has this elaborate and poeticsome speech. Love is the passion to reach out and squeeze someone tight, even as you see the thorns up close. The best part of this game is when it's parents and children. Parents hug their kids tight, thorns and all. And when the kids scream and wail when they see their worst nightmare, mummy and daddy dying in agony, there's real emotion in killing. Death by love. Isn't that just so exciting? To which Gunko replies with nothing. She doesn't say anything, just an ellipsis. So she does not in any way appreciate or understand what St. Summers is trying to create, that or she does understand it and is actively horrified or disgusted by it to the point where she just needs to disengage and ignore it. So Gunko has shown a lot of reverence for the status of a world noble, but she's not shown any interest in their lifestyle. And if anything, she actively retreats from it with her regular rituals of listening to the music of our very own Soul King Brook. In chapter 1144, Gunko revealed that she was listening to a song titled New World, which is the song that Brook performed on Sabadi right before reuniting with the crew. The trend of pretty women flipping, the barrier being erected between Gunko and the world nobles, all the food theory stuff, none of that is anywhere near as in your face as Gunko listening to this song. Because at its core, New World is a song about changing fate and also asking to see panties. Brook wrote it specifically for the return to Sabadi, as that was the island where the Straw Hats were obliterated by Kizaru, Sentomaru, Bartholomew Kuma, and also a third, Bartholomew Kuma. So Brook saw Sabadi as an island of regret, but he also viewed it as his job, his responsibility as crew musician to turn that regret into hope, into excitement, and into a message of new beginnings. Brook is the one who changed and set the tone for the Straw Hats to recover and excel, and Gunko may have a very similar thematic ability. Her Devil Fruit is all about direction and cementing the future by dictating that direction. Once Gunko conjures an arrow and decides where it's pointing, we don't know if that future can be prevented. I mean, we do. At the moment, it can be prevented by exactly one person. As Gunko herself says, those arrows are the confirmed path of my very future. A declaration of unavoidable violence. But it is possible for me to change course, which to me just screams like a character saying, yeah, I know I'm on a bad path right now, but it is possible for me to change. And of the many legendary lines Brook has had over his run in the series, one of my favorites came right before he started performing New World when he stated, music is always on our side. So I can't help but look at Gunko listening to this music and see her as on our side, because music is always on our side. And after learning the name of the song New World, St. Summers asked, Gee ha ha ha, what? You got a problem with the one we already live in? And the answer to that has to be yes. Even if Gunko won't verbalize it or take a stand against it, there is something unsettling to Gunko about the world we currently live in. Yes, she considers it to be a miracle that she was allowed to join the Holy Knights, and she does recognize the superiority of world nobles over all other living beings, but that doesn't mean that Gunko likes it. And as soon as her mindset is liberated by Gunko being shown a new potential path forward, I have to believe, in her own words, that it will will be possible for Gunko to change course, with the big major barrier to break being her fear of Nika. Gunko has stated that her greatest fear in this world is Nika, which is gonna be a pretty big problem, as Luffy is the modern day embodiment of the sun god. This fear is quite understandable though, and it's not just because of Gunko's association with the world nobles. Initially, it's very easy to write this off because all of world noble society has a fear of anything to do with the will of D, believing them to be actual demons, all of which leads back to the legacy of Joy Boy, and even further back than that to sun god Nika. But the world nobles are not the only civilization that feared Nika. According to the Harley text, Nika is a liberator and a destroyer, so I could very much see Gunko being from a lower class civilization that were taught exclusively the destroyer reading of Nika, in the same sort of way the Buccaneers seem to have exclusively passed down the liberation reading of Nika. And that's another reason why Gunko could consider joining the Holy Knights a miracle. She may see the world government as people who rescued her from the potential destruction at the hands of Nika. A very noble, very brave organization determined to protect the planet from the sheer Ragnarok that Nika wants to bring. So when Gunko can't understand why Loki won't join, from her perspective, this could be like Loki denying his own salvation and instead choosing to be condemned. So I think that what we're eventually going to have here is Gunko being confronted with Gear 5th Luffy, and Luffy proving to her that Nika is nothing to be afraid of, which could redefine her entire perspective of the world government. Due to this fear being flagged, I also can't help but feel that this is going to be used by Saint killing him at some point with his dream powers, that the world nobles might get put in a very desperate situation where they pull out Gunko's nightmare to help them fight, and we see a much more viscerally horrifying incarnation of Nika than even the evil Nika that was conjured by one of the giant kids. At the moment on Elbaph, everyone's trying to overcome their nightmares, and that may not be a theme exclusive to our protagonists. This arc could also be about Gunko facing her nightmare and overcoming it, waking up and being able to start a new day working towards building a new world, which is not something that's going to come to fruition if she remains with the same old Holy Knights. But luckily, Gunko herself does know that she and she alone has the ability to change her life's course. Liberation and destruction go hand in hand. In fact, there's a reason why Monkey D. Luffy, notorious fruit eater, villain beater, and sun heater, has two hands, and it's so that he can wield both liberation and destruction with both fists at the same time. Just ask any slobby, Whole Cake Chateau, or Egghead Island. Oh wait, you can't because they've been destroyed. And it's looking increasingly like Elbaph is going to be the next island to experience liberation via destruction. Luffy is not a traditional force of good or evil, and we now have fictional scientific proof of that. In the SBS of volume 111, we received quite valuable insight into Luffy as a creature, as Oda was asked to break down what his satellites would look like under Vegapunk's system, which divided humanity into 6 equal aspects: good, evil, thinking, wisdom, violence, and greed. According to Dr. Vegapunk, these are the 6 aspects that come together to make up a human being, or at the very least the 6 that most accurately reflect him, because not all humans are created equally, as according to Eiichiro Oda, the 6 aspects that most reflect Luffy would be 5 Yorks and 1 Atlas. So Luffy is made up of 5 parts greed and 1 part violence, which is why his solution to everything is to punch it, because he lacks the thinking and the wisdom to find another way around it. But the most interesting thing to me is that Luffy lacks any aspect of good or evil. His moral compass isn't calibrated to the same settings as the rest of humanity, or in fact, calibrated at all. And that makes so much sense when you think about the sun god being linked to both liberation and destruction, 2 concepts that are generally linked to good and evil respectively. So let's have a wonderful example of this, Baratie. During this arc, Luffy performs a maneuver that often baffles first-time readers and watchers, as he suddenly decides to attack the floating restaurant itself, to which he receives loud criticism from both the Baratie chefs and the Krieg pirates, and for the first time in this arc, both warring factions are briefly united, and what brought them together was their disapproval of Luffy. Disapproval it's a pretty light word, because the stakes were extremely high for both factions. For the chefs, their homes and livelihood were at stake, and for the Krieg pirates, their lives were on the line, because they couldn't keep sailing on the half-sunken vessel they'd arrived on, especially after Mihawk decimated it further. So what we're looking at here is essentially life or death for both factions. So there's an awful lot of stock that people are putting into what amounts to a well-arranged pile of wood. That's Luffy's perspective, remembering that Baratie isn't his dream, him, and this is before that he learns that ships in the One Piece world can have spirits residing within them. Luffy sees destroying Baratier as the quickest path to peace. If Baratier is gone, then the Krieg pirates have no prize, and therefore the fighting stops. Which doesn't seem, amazingly well thought out until we get to Sanji. The person who takes this destruction as the most personal of attacks is Sanji, who yells about how he slaved away on the ship because he has an enormous debt to repay to Zeph. And Luffy's special brand of emotional intelligence is then able to identify that this ship isn't Sanji's dream, nor is it his home. It's actually his prison. Sanji feels bound to Baratier due to his debt, and he has chosen to give his freedom in repaying this debt, despite the fact that that's not what Zeph wants. And so Luffy replies, "So you're gonna die for this ship? Getting killed is no way to repay your debt. He didn't save your life so you could throw it away. Only a coward would do that," which is a very hard-hitting point that Sanji does register. And after that lands, Luffy ceases his plan to destroy the ship. One, because Pearl gets defeated by Gin, which changes the landscape of the fight, but more importantly because Luffy had now cut Sanji's binds. He had mentally liberated Sanji from the idea that he had to give his life to protect this ship, which starts an emotional journey that culminates in Sanji being free to pursue his dream of finding the All Blue. It's a very simple but perfect example of liberation and destruction being conceptually entwined. To dumb it down even further, how can you free a prisoner without destroying their binds? But to define Luffy in this moment would depend entirely on your personal perspective. If you're Sanji, Zeph, Gin, or any of the characters who understand the true meaning, then Luffy is a warrior of liberation. However, if you're one of the auxiliary characters observing without all of the context, then Luffy is a demon of destruction, which is almost certainly how both Joy Boy and Nika have been viewed in their respective acts, which is why we have two very different interpretations of their purpose. It's very easy to see Luffy as one or the other, and quite conflicting to see him as both. And someone who did see Luffy as a destroyer was Madame Charlie, who prophesied that he would destroy Fishman Island, a future that we're still waiting to come to fruition. However, in the meantime, the Fishman Island arc had a similar dual focus on liberation and destruction, and they're both present within the Noah, a very important vessel, as the Noah is both the symbol and mechanism of liberation of the entire Fishman race. It's the vehicle that will one day carry the entire civilization to go up, 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 and live under the sun on the surface. But in a very tricksy twist, this liberation becomes the cause of their destruction when Vanderdecken's abilities threaten to use the Noah to destroy all of Fishman Island. And so, Mr. Monkey D. Luffy, the modern inheritor of the Sun God, does what Sun God does best, one of two things. He says, "I, Monkey Man, could liberate the Noah. No, wait, it's already liberated. In fact, too liberated. That's kind of the problem. So I guess I'll destroy it." And so Luffy begins relentlessly punching the arc with the intention to not stop until there's nothing left. And at this time, he is being watched by almost every citizen of Fishman Island who is completely behind him. If he can destroy the Noah, the island will be saved. But if he can't do it in time, Fishman Island will be pulverized to dust. Don't give up, Straw Hat. We're not going to give in and run. We believe in you. And I don't think that a lot of people really recognize just what it took for the Fishmen to support Luffy like this. Yes, in this situation, your options are you either destroy the Noah or you die, so it seems like an easy choice. But in giving their consent to eradicate the Noah, the people of Fishman Island are also making the decision to give up on their own liberation. They are prepared to significantly delay or more than likely never reach their dreams and stay trapped on the sea floor. It's a rough situation. The Noah is the most historically significant artifact on Fishman Island, as well as the most significant for their future. But at the same time, they won't have a future unless they give up that future. So thankfully, Shirahoshi was able to cry to the Sea Kings in time and preserve that future for them by taking custody of the Noah. But it's still an example of Luffy being an agent of destruction, which isn't always a bad thing. Destruction is a very negative word, but often in One Piece, it is the key to liberation and salvation. With that said, Baratier and Fishman Island, they were examples of very good outcomes. Luffy destroyed, but the destruction was minimal, and everyone who Baratier, the Noah, or Fishman Island itself meant something to got to hold on to that meaning. But arcs don't always end that well, and some of them do make the innate fear of Nika quite understandable. Such as Skypiea, which was in quite a similar situation to Baratier. This part of the world featured two factions fighting over a piece of land, the part of Jaya that shot up into the sky, with the Shandians claiming it to be their native home, whilst the Skypieans argued that this vast was the domain of God. Because on a cultural note, I love that the Skypieans revere Earth in the same way that most of our cultures revere the sky. For most of human history, the sky was something that was so unattainable to us, so we saw it as the domain of the gods. But to Skypians, regular old Earth was unattainable to them, so they viewed it as the opposite. However, what ended up happening on Skypea was the complete destruction of Angel Island, leaving the Skypians without their native home, forcing two cultures to end their centuries-long feud to come together in order to both prosper on the vast that was left after Enel's defeat. In this case, both civilizations were trapped by warfare, because after 400 years, there was too much history, too much pain, and very little appetite for peace after going on this all-war diet. And what it took to liberate the Skypians and the Shandians from this endless war was destruction. This is another case where freedom could not have been attained without that destructive catalyst, and this is also a case where this destruction was not directly caused by Luffy. It was of course Enel and his Arc Maxim, but Luffy isn't always directly responsible for the destructive elements of the Sun God prophecy. In fact, it's generally not his active decision to destroy things. It's more that destruction just so happens to fatefully follow Luffy wherever he goes. For example, it wasn't Luffy who chose to enact the birdcage on Dressrosa, which obliterated the majority of the island. It was implemented by Doflamingo, but only after Luffy arrived on Dressrosa. So in many ways, you can see Luffy as an omen of destruction. If he rocks up on your island, then something extremely bad is almost certainly about to happen. However, due to the fact that he's on your side, that something bad also has an element of good, which is the promise that following this inevitable destruction will be a rebirth. Much like the ancient mythology of the One Piece planet Blue Star. In the Harley text, the world is destroyed and reborn multiple times, and we're said to be heading that way again by the end of the series. In the case of Dressrosa, the benefit of leveling the island was to free everyone from the tyranny of Doflamingo. It liberated everyone who had been turned into a toy slave by Sugar's abilities, as well as everyone who had to fight in the Corridor Coliseum to make a living. And on a more individual note, it liberated Trafalgar Law from his life of revenge dedicated in Doflamingo's general direction. However, for a better example of Luffy being an omen of destruction, I would point to Enies Lobby, or I guess the area that once was Enies Lobby. The fact that this island no longer exists has very little to do with Luffy himself. Yes, he invaded the island, but the response of the world government was to destroy it, which was caused by the fateful accident of Spandam mistakenly activating the Golden Denden Mushi, but no one at Marine Headquarters questioned it. They just carried out the order. And so they wiped 800 years of history off the face of the planet, without so much as a, why are we doing this? But it did liberate Nico Robin, not just literally, because the Straw Hats got her out of handcuffs and everything, took her away, had a good time, but it also liberated her because the very symbol of justice that had Robin convinced she did not have the right to live was destroyed before her eyes. And as much as it really wasn't his fault, Luffy was credited as being the one to destroy Enies Lobby, because I guess it's pretty embarrassing to admit that you accidentally nuked your own island. But that only reinforces the view of Nika as a destroyer. Back in the day of Joy Boy, or if there was an actual Nika in the ancient world, then they could have been subject to similar situations, present for higher levels of destruction that wasn't their fault, but they were credited for it at the time, spreading the fear of Nika as a destroyer and very much downplaying the elements of liberation. Although earlier I said that destruction isn't always a bad thing, which we've explored quite well, but in the same way that destruction isn't always bad, I should say that liberation isn't always good. This is an idea that we're currently grappling with during the Elbaph arc. At the time of this recording, Luffy has just freed Loki, and there is a big old question mark regarding whether or not that was the right or wrong thing to do. And much like everything else, I don't think it'll be an exclusively good or bad decision. It's a bit of both and everything in between, and perhaps something similar to the Impel Down example, where Luffy broke into the prison with the sole mission of liberation. He was on a quest to free his brother Ace, and along the way he became an integral leader in orchestrating one of the most disastrous events in world government history, being the mass breakout of Impel Down prisoners. Some of the prisoners escaping was objectively good. Freeing Jinbei, for example, big positive for the world. Others are a bit more of a gray area, like freeing Crocodile and Mr. One, who have previously caused and will go on to cause a fair bit more suffering on the planet. And if you're a big world government and or marine supporter, then freeing Crocodile is one of the most evil actions that has ever been taken, as he went on to found Cross Guild and is now one of the biggest threats to global stability as we know it. I personally believe that freeing Crocodile will be a net positive, but there are a lot of others that are objectively negative. Were it not for Luffy, there's no way that Blackbeard and his crew would have been able to free all of the level 6 prisoners. Blackbeard would have done his best to invade, but he would have been wiped out by Magellan, and Shiryu wouldn't have been free to find them an antidote. Also, Also, Magellan wouldn't have been distracted by Luffy, and he might have stayed to make sure that the Blackbeard pirates actually, died. Either way, the release of the level 6 prisoners is partially Luffy's responsibility. Most of them were put there for a very good reason, and they are now free, which is a definite net negative on the world. So liberation isn't always as positive as it sounds. And it also shouldn't be ignored that on rare occasions, there's very little difference between liberation and destruction. Marineford is a tragically wondersome example of this, as Luffy did manage to free Ace, but Ace died anyway. And the Marines who were victorious had their entire headquarters destroyed, all for the sake of remaining very much unliberated and still very much trapped within the world government system. With all of that said, Luffy is still the common omen here. Would Marineford have been destroyed if Luffy wasn't at the Paramount War? Yeah, probably. But the fact that he was there is another of so many instances where Luffy's very existence has been in direct correlation with the destruction of his surroundings. Meanwhile, Whole Cake Island was a lovely arc that hits all of the beats already mentioned in this video. Luffy invades the island on a mission to liberate Sanji, and along the way he becomes an omen for the destruction of Whole Cake Chateau, as well as the untold damage caused across Totterland with Big Mom's rampage. I'm not going to go through all of that because this is very physical destruction and you're all very smart and you get the point, but I want to focus on a different kind of destruction here, which was the mental deconstruction of Charlotte Katakuri. Almost the entire climax of this arc features Luffy gradually destroying Katakuri's mindset, which is all to do with building the illusion of perfection. Katakuri is a man trapped by perfection. He goes out of his way to enforce it upon himself for the sake of putting up a barrier to protect his siblings, and throughout this fight, Luffy shows Katakuri that keeping yourself captured by an idea is not the only way to inspire hope and belief in the ones you want to protect. Luffy destroys Katakuri mentally, which liberates Katakuri from the chains that he's put on himself. And it also gives him the hope that one day he and his family will be liberated from Big Mom as well. And this brand of mental liberation happens a lot in One Piece. In fact, the very first act Luffy took after leaving Fuchsia Village was to do the same to Kobe, to mentally push him until Kobe was capable of standing up to Alvida and taking control of his own life. It took a lot of bullying, a lot of mental destruction, but we got there. And this trend of One Piece as a whole now brings us to the very uncertain future of Elbaph. Because if there was ever an island set up for liberation via destruction, it's this one. In fact, destruction is baked into Elbaphian culture. This is where we learned that Nika was considered a destroyer, and the island itself is heavily based in Norse mythology, which seems to be building towards an inevitable Ragnarok event. And one that seems rather unstoppable because we're not just dealing with one sun god on this island. What we are doing, we are multi-godding on Elbaph. There's at least 2 people who can take on the sun god form and a third one who claims that he is. And there's actually a couple of good arguments in favor of the destruction of Elbaph. One is that it would force a sharp embrace of King Harold's ideals of peace by severing the legacy of war deeply ingrained in the island's history, and it would also emphasize peace because the giants are gonna need somewhere to live, and making friends with the other giant kingdoms would go a long way towards providing that. But then of course there's the One Piece factor, which is the idea that the destruction of Elbaph is such an obvious and highlighted idea that it's ripe for subversion. Or just as with most arcs so far, Luffy is gonna work his magic, tap into that inner atlas, and solve everyone's problems with a solid mixture of both destruction and liberation, ending more with the latter to convince the giants that the sun god is a force of generally good and to not be so afraid of the incoming end of the world. This man is not what he seems, or perhaps even not who he seems, which is very difficult to see because it's hard to see behind a man of that beard, that cloak, and that helmet, the latter of which very conveniently can never be removed. So I want to be clear from the start that this is not my idea. A comment named Aquitas RJ posted this on one of my videos, but I do kind of like it. The basic premise is that King Harold is not dead and is in fact currently masquerading as Jarl, hiding behind that big bushy body beard and having the gag of the sword in the head and the helmet that saved him to ensure that the helmet never gets removed. Because if the helmet were to ever get removed, then it would clearly reveal Harold's scarring from the horns he had removed. But why did Harold do this? Where did the real Jarl go? And what the crap does Loki have to do with anything? Well, we're going to answer all of that, as well as some of my personal red flags regarding Jarl in general. But one big reason why I'm willing to take this idea semi-seriously is because Oda really, and I mean really, loves using a trope known as the hidden monarch, which is the idea that you place a character of great political importance somewhere in plain sight for a revelation down the line. Oh my god, he was actually the king? And Oda's use of this trope begins all the way back at Reverse Mountain with Miss Wednesday. When we met Miss Wednesday, she seemed like a comical throwaway villain who turns out to be Princess Nefertari Vivi of the Alabaster Kingdom. And this is what laid the foundation for almost every kingdom story that Oda would tell from here on out. Although it's fun to note that Miss Wednesday wasn't Oda's original intention for Vivi, he just got caught in a place where he needed Vivi to appear and decided to use Miss Wednesday to fill that role. So she was more of an accidental hidden monarch, hidden even to Oda himself. But this idea would continue in a very intentional way into Skypiea with Garnfall, a man who we thought was a mere valiant knight, but who actually turned out to be the former and I guess future god of Skypiea, which was the end to our kingdom arcs post-time skip. However, it should also be said that Shaki turned out to be a hidden monarch of Amazon Lily. But post-time skip is where this idea really takes off, because there is such a huge amount of time spent on kingdom stories as opposed to pre-time skip. For example, Dressrosa, when we were introduced to the gladiator Ricky, who seems almost like an extra who was called in to fill a space in the B block because someone important didn't show up. But of course, we later go on to learn that this is King Riku Doldo III, former and future king of Dressrosa. I have to say, Dressrosa very much overdid it with the hidden monarch concept, because it also had a hidden monarch in Viola, Rebecca, and arguably even Kuros, because he became part of the royal family. Meanwhile, on Wano, Oda gave us Komurasaki, who turned out to be gasp Princess Hiyori, as well as the insane plot twist that was Tenguyama being the former shogun of Wano, Kozuki Sukiyaki, who I would say is the character who has the most in common with this theory, as a former ruler who decided to disguise himself as a citizen. But before getting into that, I feel like I'd be remiss not to mention the most obvious example, being our very own Vinsmoke Sanji, who I spent a considerable percentage of my life reading before he was unmasked as a prince of the Germa Kingdom. And that's why ideas like this are, at least to me, more likely to be true than your usual crackpot stuff, because when it comes to hidden monarchs, no one is safe. Oda cannot help but narratively ejaculate royalty over everyone. There are of course exceptions to this. Fishman Island and Drum Island don't use this trope, but it has become extremely common across One Piece as a whole. But look, when it comes to the Elbaph example of Harold and Jarl, there's a few ways that this could have happened. The first is that there may have been an ideological clash between Harold and Jarl. I'll detail this more in a bit, but Jarl was at least, not initially, in favor of the peace plan proposed by Harold. Jarl was a very warrior, tradition-centric kind of guy man, and could have seen Harold as a threat to that philosophy. And as one of the greatest warriors of giant kind, age aside, Jarl could have stormed into the castle in a desperate attempt to save what he believes is the soul of Elbaph, quite literally because of his belief in the proud death of warriors. And so in this effort, Harold and or Loki do everything to stop Jarl but end up killing him, resulting in a bit of an ideological problem, which is that the King of Peace has just slayed Elbaph's most revered and respected warrior, which would potentially turn Jarl into a martyr for anyone else currently not on board with Harold's ideas. So what we do, right, we come up with a cunning plan to reverse that. Harold disguises himself as Jarl and turns the memory of Harold himself into the martyr, with Loki taking the blame. However, from the outside, it seems like Harold and Jarl were united, and so the people of Elbaph unite to bring their dream to fruition. But there is also a much darker idea, which is that Harold did go genuinely mad and a bit bloodlusty, maybe as an unintended effect of removing his horns, which eventually triggered a rampage that saw the deaths of the giant soldiers, as well as Jarl, who tried to valiantly stop Harold. And then what we have is a different instigator, but it ends up being the same problem to solve, with Loki perhaps taking the blame for his father's crimes and suggesting that Harold masquerade as Jarl to ensure the peace of Elbaph. And after getting into dress-ups, Loki may even have stabbed Harold in the head to 1, make sure that no one would ever try to remove the helmet and discover Harold's very easily identifiable head, and 2, to somewhat brutally lobotomize Harold and halt his rampage. And if that sword were to ever be removed, then by the vague laws of fictional pirate biology, all of those memories and feelings would come flooding back to Harold. And the same also applies to Jarl, if Jarl is Jarl, I should say. But either scenario would make what I believe to be the eventual Loki Haradin makeup session possible, because the easiest way to have that happen is for Loki to have sacrificed his own well-being for the sake of an ideal that Haradin also believes in. You know, the very typical One Piece stuff. Oh, you sacrificed yourself for us, cry, 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 etc. But one fairly obvious piece of evidence against this idea is that Jarl does look very, very old, and Harold did not. Although I would say that we have no idea how old Harold's portrait is. This could have been made a century or two ago when he was much, much younger. But Jarl's age is also very, how do I put this, superficial, because you can't actually see most of any of him. His body is completely obscured by a beard, and most of his head is obscured by the helmet. Really, this is as much of Jarl as we see. So it's really just the eyes and the nose that we need to be somewhat convincing, and we could get away with this. Although I personally can't find any visual evidence to suggest that this isn't Jarl. Sometimes Oda does forget to draw the liver spots on the right side of his face during the Elbaph arc, and if that was a consistent feature, then I'd say we might be onto something. But then there's also other times when the liver spots do appear, so it's more likely to be an art error. Also, Jarl still speaks and laughs in the same way that he did previously, so I do think this idea is pretty incredibly unlikely, but still fun to think about. Although casting my mind back to the early days of Wano, I definitely feel like anyone who had dared say that Tenguyama was actually Kozuki Sukiyaki, mate, they would have been laughed right off the internet. Their ISP would have cut their connection. However, with the power of retrospect, very few people would admit to that, and instead they just say, nah bruh, it was obvious all along. I knew, I'm very clever. And the issue at hand, internet man, is your own reading comprehension. And maybe that's true, but it's probably not, because I know you. But look, putting the hidden monarch idea aside from now, there is also an idea that I consider much, much more likely, which is that Jarl is in fact Jarl, but he's a very, very bad man and a potential traitor of Elbaph. Currently, of all of the giants we know, Jarl actually has one of the greater motivations to stand against King Harold. Jarl is 408 years old. He is the oldest living giant, and when we first met him, he was actively arguing against the ideas of Mother Carmel. He was insistent that Elbaph must not forget that they are warriors. Now, to be fair to the old man, this was 63 years ago, and people can change over time. It's actually said that people grow and evolve so much that they become entirely new people every 5 years or so. So for Jarl, that's like 12 and a half new people. Who knows who he is now? But something even more impactful to Jarl than taking a sword in the brain was the death of his companion Yorl. They'd been battle partners for 300 years at that point, and Jarl wasn't so much upset that Yorl was going to die. He was upset because of the way that he was going to die. Yorl wasn't going to fall gloriously on a battlefield bathed in the blood of his enemies. None of that. Instead, what he was going to do, right, is he was going to be killed by a child throwing a tantrum because she couldn't eat semla that one day. To be quite specific, Jarl said, "A warrior is not defined by his years, but how he dies. This is an unforgivable crime." And to me, that's always been a very powerful quote and has shaped how I view the giants of Elbaph, which is why it was more than a little surprising to actually get to the island and seeing it having undergone such a radical shift towards peace. And while I can certainly see the younger members of Elbaph taking to such an idea of peace proposed by King Harold, I have a much harder time seeing how he convinced the legend that is Jarl. And if anything, this could have instilled a genuine fear into Jarl, who, after having witnessed the undignified and not at all warrior's death of Yorl, was now starting to not only worry about himself, what happens to my soul if I can't die a dignified death, but the soul of every citizen of Elbaph. If I'm Jarl and I have this potent belief in the core of Elbaph being its warrior heritage, and more importantly, the spiritual belief in a warrior's death, then the last thing I would want to implement is a new age of peace, because this goes to the Viking beliefs of Valhalla, a hall of slain warriors who live blissfully in the afterlife. But it's an afterlife that can only be reached if a warrior has died honorably in battle. And the kind of peace that King Harold was proposing may have meant that every Elbaphian warrior still alive had just lost their opportunity to enter that afterlife, and that no future generations of Elbaphians would have access to it either. So again, if I'm Jarl, I'm not hugely happy with this peace business, because it's not just a threat to day-to-day society as I've lived it for the last 300 to 400 years, it's also a threat to my core spirituality. And that turns into a case where I could see Jarl having taken a stand against Harold, or even conspiring to kill him, like a coward in the shadows, because he may not have wanted Harold to die one of them glorious deaths. But it goes a lot deeper than that, and this could very well hinge on how Jarl interprets the purpose of the sun god Nika. If Jarl, for example, happened to believe in the god of destruction interpretation, then he'd also have reason to block Harold's quest for peace, believing that the path forward must be destruction, and if every giant's dream is to become Nika, then that dream would never be fulfilled in a strictly peaceful society. And just how depressing is that? To not having any hope of the world being destroyed a third time, as stated by the Harley text, which by the way was originally told to us by Jarl. And with this in mind, you could even make an argument for why Jarl allowed Charlotte Linlin to live after killing Jarl. The straightforward idea was that this was a plea from Mother Carmel, who Jarl greatly respected, and of course he would because she also positioned herself as an emissary of the sun god, and even worked with the world government to set up that false execution where she appeared to be blessed by the sun. So it's pretty hard to ignore a request from someone so seemingly related to the deity you worship so. But also, the more we learn about Nika, the more that Charlotte Linlin actually appears to be fulfilling the destruction reading of the sun god. For one thing, the incident with Linlin occurred on the winter solstice, which was a festival dedicated to celebrating the death and rebirth of the sun. And during this festival, a god of destruction was indeed manifested through the death of Jarl, although before Jarl died, he labeled Linlin as a quote, god of disaster. However, Jarl also said, "You've made a terrible mistake, Linlin. You do not have the right to thank the sun. Even a child can only be forgiven for so much." And that's why I'm endlessly keen to find out more about this mythos, because aesthetics aside, Charlotte Linlin was kind of doing what a huge amount of giants believe the sun god is intended to do. Although Mother Carmel did use her devil fruit powers to summon a homie named Pandora to quell the fire, and then claimed that it was a miracle due to the sun god. So there's conflicting sun god narratives at play here. But let's go full conspiracy for a second. Let's say that Jarl wholeheartedly believes in the destruction reading, then even though she committed an unforgivable crime in his eyes, Linlin could be that fabled Nika, because no other child on this planet has ever been born with the same physical capabilities as her. Capabilities that still have yet to be explained in any way. As far as we know, both of her parents were just regular humans. So it's almost like a religious birth narrative, that this one child was imbued with the spirit of a god of disaster, or said god chose to enter the world through that particular baby hole. And so killing someone who is potentially your god may not be seen as the greatest of ideas either, no matter how much Harudin begged Jarl to kill Linlin. Harudin yelled that Jarl must kill her, and when Jarl walked away, Harudin exclaimed, "What has become of the pride of Elbaph?" And also, as a result of this incident, Harudin's least favorite food is semla. But again, after watching Jarl, such a proud warrior, die such a pathetic death, I can definitely see Jarl not wanting that to happen to him or anyone else, even if it meant betraying King Harold. And so earlier, I went over the hidden monarch trope, and while this one isn't anywhere near as common, Oda has also been liking the hidden traitor trope a lot lately as well, which is something that we did see in pre-time skip One Piece with Galila and CP9. However, Oda gave that a rest until very recently with Wano, and in fact, well before Wano, Oda went to some pretty amazing lengths to insert Kanjuro as a traitor, and immediately after on Egghead Island, we also had York as a traitor. Back-to-back traitor stories, both incredibly successful, so if it works, why not do it a third time? And it works especially well when the traitor turns out to be a wacky and primarily comic character with a really odd quirk, like how Kanjuro apparently couldn't draw and disarmed us with that hilarity, or like how York was a bit of an airhead who served as a communal toilet for the Vegapunks. And going with that trend, perhaps a feeble old man with a sword in his head who keeps saying his hilarious catchphrase about how his helmet saved his life could very well be a traitor. But when it comes to traitors, there's usually an even darker twist. It's not just that they've been there working for their own purposes, they've usually been working with a much darker, more sinister force. Kanjuro with Orochi, York with the Five Elders, and here's the darkest possible outcome for Elbaph, which would be that Jarl was working with Mother Carmel this whole time, and everything we saw about Jarl's criticism about Carmel's ideals was overcompensating in public to seem innocent. However, the god of disaster struck, and Carmel was forced to leave Elbaph, making Jarl the primary contact of the world government, and perhaps explaining how our holy knights were able to fast travel right into Oris Castle. So look, I personally don't want to believe it. At the moment, I have a lot of trouble believing that any Elbaph giant could be a villain, even though we've been introduced to at least 3 possibilities with Loki, Harold, and now my own personal thoughts about Jarl. And in the end, this video especially is just the ravings of a lunatic on the internet, but it's also a strong credit to Oda's writing that he surprised us so many times that I am looking everywhere I can for the next one. Old Man Jarl could just be Old Man Jarl, but Oda is capable of anything, and after Kanjuro and York, I think that my initial trust in any unexplored characters is minimal at best. But you let me know in the comments, what are your thoughts on Mr. Jarl? Prince Loki is a good boy, but he's acting evil in order to protect the citizens of Elbaph, and all of this was set up by King Harold and, of all people, Mother Carmel. And I think that what we're in for is another classic One Piece tragedy as we discover the sacrifice made by Loki for the sake of his people. So let's talk about the initial impression of Prince Loki, which may have been designed to deliberately misguide us. Because going back on Loki's introduction, there is something very sneaky that I should point out, which is that our initial impression of Loki is set up long before we actually meet him. Because a few pages previous, a giant dude says, "The king had another official child known as the Accursed Prince. He committed all manner of evil acts and was sentenced to crucifixion a few years back, but nearly escaped his punishment. It took all of our warriors to get him under control. His desperate desire for a legendary devil fruit passed down through the Elbaph royal line led him to kill his father, King Harold, and eat the fruit. The next time that Loki, the Accursed Prince, is unleashed, the world will be brought to ruin. He is the shame of Elbaph." And these words are a very clever thing for Oda to do, because the words of this giant are priming us for Loki. Regardless of who Loki actually is in fictional reality, our introduction to him was colored by these words, some of those words being evil, accursed, punishment, ruin, shame, etc. So many bad things. So when we do actually meet Loki, that's what we're expecting. And because Loki doesn't present an immediate contrast to this, we assign all of those values to Loki regardless of whether or not it's accurate. Loki introduced himself as a resident of Warland, which once lived and breathed warfare. Loki, the sun god who brings the world to an end, which admittedly does sound quite intimidating and a bit not good, and so it gives the illusion of confirming everything that we heard about him earlier in the same chapter. These words about warfare, being a god, and ending the world make it very easy to assign values like evil, accursed, and shame. However, Loki hasn't actually said or done anything to confirm those values. And this is the same sort of principle as why social media, and in fact media in general, can be quite dangerous. Because if you hear someone state that this person over here that you've never met is evil, then you're going to be viewing all of that person that you've never met's actions and statements through that lens of evil, whether you realize it or not. Someone else has colored your perception. And while that's a bit of a concerning issue in the real world, no one cares about that because it's story time now. And in the story realm, this is a simple but incredible tool for writers to use to mislead their readers. And I personally bought into it. Those two initial Loki chapters had me 90-something% convinced that he was going to be the major antagonist of this arc. And in retrospect, that was a colored conclusion because I wasn't judging Loki. I was judging the words of this guy, who according to the One Piece wiki is named Quintuple ? So for now, we'll just call him Mark for short, but this dude doesn't even have a real name yet. He may as well have been a completely anonymous Reddit poster, and yet his words shaped my entire view of Loki. And I'm sure that Mark means well, but in situations like this, we should be looking for a more reliable source, and we do have one. Because our future pirate king may not know how to navigate, but when it comes to people, his moral compass is more finely tuned than anyone else in this world. And the one thing that did consistently give me pause for thought with Loki is how comfortable Luffy is around him. And I mean this quite literally. When they met, Luffy decided to casually and comfortably lie down on Loki. And in many ways, it's a lot easier to look at Luffy from the perspective of being a wild animal than a human. He mainly operates on instincts and vibes. And here, Luffy wasn't just comfortable with Loki, but he actually deliberately sought Loki out when he felt his presence on the bridge. So to Luffy, Loki actually possesses an attractive quality, something that makes others want to be around him, which is a trait that Luffy himself has. The ability that Dracula Mihawk once called the most dangerous in the world. So we can add that to the pile of Luffy-Loki similarities. But for a man imprisoned in the underworld, Loki has a very active social life and a long list of allies. In chapter 1131, it's revealed that Loki has a legion of colossal animal loyalists who Luffy makes friends with instantly, but who Loki also describes as friends. And we really should not ignore any use of the F word. Most traditional bad guys don't tend to use the word friend, especially when it comes to animals. It's more something along the lines of, these are my underlings, these are my beasts. And given that Loki's friends are the same animals from One Piece Strong World, it's worth stating that Golden Lion Shiki only ever spoke of these animals as tools, which is the standard One One Piece bad guy way to view the existence of others. This is a very simplistic way to view things, but it does work more often than not with One Piece. If a character is able to form a genuine friendship with an animal, then they tend to be more on the good side of the spectrum. Think of characters like Vivian, Karoo, Brook and Laboon, Konus and Sue, Gaimon and all of his weird friends. There aren't that many antagonists who have that sort of camaraderie with an animal. And if they do have animals, it's more to use them like the Arlong pirates did with Momu and like the Caribou pirates did with Momu again. But not only that, it isn't just animals. Loki also has a group of human followers in the underworld which he describes as follows. Those other little ones are humans who chose to do battle with Elbaph. They wear stinking robes to turn away the ravenous beasts, but they only delay the inevitable. They are corpses already. And to these rather harsh words, Loki's followers respond with, "Now that's really uncalled for, sir," which is a pretty hilarious response to being called a corpse, and it gives me the impression that Loki was acting when he described his human followers, and that the human followers know Loki well enough to know that what he's saying isn't actually how he feels. It's almost as if Loki needs to maintain a certain appearance with Luffy, or a certain appearance in general, one that we now know is almost certainly a facade. But again, Loki is portrayed as less of an underworld prisoner and more of a Disney princess. He seems to attract friends and allies from every direction, even those who aren't able to be here physically, as we discover in chapter 1134, which came with a pretty big translation gap between the scans and the official, and the gap in question did unfortunately occur during Loki's section when he's on the snail phone to either Mossa or Shaggy, depending on which translation you read. The official translation went with Shaggy, which is a bit, zoink Scoob, but it's probably about as well as this could have been translated, because Mossa Mossa is an onomatopoeia that's often used to refer to someone who is excessively hairy, shaggy, and is generally not well put together. And so there's an overall impression of poor hygiene and personal grooming. And part of this definitely comes across because the Denden Mushi is projecting quite a hairy fella on the other end. However, something that gets completely lost in the official translation is that Loki uses an honorific in this conversation. He refers to Shaggy or Mossa as Mossa Ko, and there's been a lot of internet linguists looking into this honorific because it's quite unusual. And what they have discovered is that Ko is an antiquated honorific used for ye old nobility, and the conclusion from here is that this Mossa that Loki is speaking to is part of some royal family. Not necessarily on Elbaph, however, the interpretation of native Japanese speakers is completely different. To native speakers, the Ko honorific seems to be used in a more mocking way, in the same sort of way that we would sarcastically refer to someone as sire or my lord. It's not something that you would take seriously, but it is hard to tell which case it is because Elbaph is a land that is very much trapped back in time, and a lot of the other giants do have other antiquated ways of speaking. So Loki could be talking to someone of royal lineage, or he could be giving someone a cute ironic nickname. And actually, if you're familiar with Hachiko, also known as the greatest dog to have ever lived and who inspired Oda to create Choo Choo, he is a perfect example of this. The Ko in Hachiko is this honorific. But regardless, for an evil being, king murdering, ruin wanting, shame bringing incarnate of pure destruction, Loki sure does have a lot of friends, doesn't he? And that's because deep down, Loki has a bit of the K word going on, as Mossa and or Shaggy stated. I've recently realized that those fearsome words of yours hide your kindness. And now Loki didn't take kindly to this accusation of kindness, and we'll get to that shortly. But firstly, we don't know how long Loki has been speaking to his long-distance friend. However, it's likely to have been at least a few years at this point, and it took all of that time for Loki's friend to realize that his strong, powerful, brutal words are acting as a shroud to his kindness. But that's something that Luffy realized immediately. Luffy wasn't bothered by any of Loki's words, except for what he said about Shanks, but otherwise it didn't matter how vividly horrible Loki's descriptions were or how volatile his threats were. Luffy's mind just translated all of that as, hey, Straw Hat Man, wanna be friends? Which is why he's apparently gone on to make a deal with Loki and is keeping it a secret in the same way that small children do. So I think the good guy Loki is becoming a pretty solid thought. But it does come with three very important questions to answer. Firstly, even after having said all of this, Loki does appear to have a genuine hatred for the concept of kindness, so we need to figure out why that is. Secondly, and this could be connected to the first part, but we need to establish why Loki does verbally portray himself in the most unfriendly and apocalyptic of ways. And finally, and potentially most difficultly, you know what? I'm not doing it again. We're sticking with difficultly. We need to explain why Loki killed his father, Harold, because that's probably the biggest obstacle in the good guy Loki hypothesis. But let's start with kindness. This is the one aspect of Loki that I can confidently say is not an an act. He has a solid hatred of kindness, and initially I thought that this could have something to do with the Lola situation, because from what we've seen of the vaguely shaped Loki of this time, he was a much happier, gentler individual, and his aversion to kindness may have to do with Lola's rejection of him. The idea is that Loki was as kind as he could possibly be, and that's what left him open, that's what left him vulnerable to being hurt the most, which would be a pretty big blow to the strongest warriorman of Elbaph. For all of his muscle and battle power, he was unable to protect his heart from being broken. However, I don't think that's it, and if it is, I don't think it's everything. I guess it could definitely be a part of it, a greater theme as to why Loki despises kindness, but we should actually look back a little further, because one of the kindest people we've ever been introduced to in One Piece was Mother Carmel, the lovable saint who dedicated her life to others and ran an orphanage on Elbaph where nothing bad ever happened at all. And look, if it did, it certainly didn't have anything to do with child trafficking. Mother Carmel is the perfect illustration of the danger of kindness, because being kind is almost universally seen as a positive value. But people who are overly kind can be taken advantage of, or they can take advantage of others with that kindness if they so desired, which is exactly what Carmel did. She used her kindness as a poison pill to set up and manage her business of selling children to the world government. However, that is not the only influence that Carmel had on this world, and we may be seeing Carmel's legacy playing out on Elbaph as we speak. So to be clear, Loki was born in the same year that Carmel died, so this aversion to kindness or faux kindness would not have been caused by her directly. However, there is another almost sickeningly beloved individual on this island known as the late King Harold, the one that Loki allegedly murdered, and King Harold has been credited as the one who changed Elbaph and brought it into a new age with the philosophy of, quote, don't fight with other countries, trade with them, which is a lovely idea. I like it a lot, but it wasn't Harold's idea, it was Carmel's idea. In Big Mom's flashback, Charles says, Carmel's ideas about trade over plunder are all well and good, but we must not forget that we are warriors, which is a line that comes back to smack us right in the sabos in chapter 1134, because it appears that King Harold adopted Carmel's philosophy. Now, being as generous as I can be, this means that Carmel accidentally set Elbaph on the path to peace, that her horrid existence did actually have a surprisingly positive impact in the world. However, to be as not generous as I can, perhaps being taken in by Carmel's words implies that King Harold was on a bit of a similar wavelength to Carmel, and him adopting her philosophy could indicate that the kind, benevolent, and universally beloved King Harold may have been none of those things it is that I just said, and was another figure abusing kindness for his own very unkind goals. And this is the faux kindness that Loki would have been exposed to. And I would propose that one day Loki discovered what Harold's plans were. He saw his father, the truth of his father, for the first time, and on that day he realized that everything Harold presented himself to be was a lie. And as for what Harold's end goal could have been, one idea is working with the world government to demilitarize Elbaph, as it is the last army in the world that the world government actually fears, and King Harold may have been planning to sell his own people for whatever benefits the world government offered him, much like York did with Egghead Island. So Loki discovers this, and as a man who doesn't like bad things, he wants to put a stop to it, which resulted in the death of King Harold. I say death because I'm not 100% convinced that Loki actually killed him. Oda likes to keep his protagonist pretty undisputedly pure, and if Loki is a good guy after all, then I think there's going to be more to this Harold incident than we've been led to believe. Something that keeps Loki's hands clean, but this could also explain why Loki is doing absolutely nothing at all to try and prove his innocence. Because Loki saw how kindness was abused, and he decided to go in the exact opposite direction, to become a villain worthy of fear. And when I say that, I mean to be feared by the world government, thus resulting in his special bounty of 2.6 billion berries, but also resulting in the protection of Elbaph, as if Loki's very existence is giving the giants of Elbaph a reason to stay strong, something that ensures they will never completely demilitarize and embrace 100% peace, because at any point the demonic Loki could escape the underworld and destroy them all. So they need to be strong and ready in the event that he does, and that strength is what stops the world government coming in and taking Elbaph for themselves. It's slightly complicated, but this is also very classic One Piece. The idea of a tragic figure putting up this villainous act for years for the sake of his people. Other notable examples of this could include Kozuki Oden, who danced Naked for 5 years for the sake of the people of Wano, or Bartholomew Kuma embracing the role of a tyrant for Jewelry Bonnie, or even the Kokoyashi villagers acting like they hated Nami army in order to give her an opportunity to flee and be safe without worrying about them. And even without that established framing, One Piece does have a rather well-established trope of island citizens hating the person most looking out for their best interests, such as the people of Alabasta rising up against King Cobra, or the hatred of King Riku on Dressrosa after Doflamingo framed him, or say Hody Jones rallying support against King Neptune, and so on and so forth. It happens a lot, so it wouldn't be surprising if it's happening again, because it's a very powerful device. Transmuting a character's desire to protect their people into hatred directed at them from the people, and then further transmuting that into tragedy when everyone realizes what fools they've been and what that person has suffered through this entire time. Because other than this Harold incident, we still have yet to see or hear evidence of Loki even harming another giant. Because remember the words of Mark, the king had another official child, known as the Accursed Prince. He committed all manner of evil acts and was sentenced to crucifixion a few years back, but nearly escaped his punishment. It took all of our warriors to get him under control. And a lot of people interpreted that as Loki attacking the giants as the bad, evil man he is. But to me, it sounds more like Loki tried to escape and the rest of the giants went after him. And even Loki's offer to Luffy to destroy a pirate crew can be seen in quite a moral way. Loki doesn't offer to destroy just anyone. He specifies that it has to be the kind of people who are generally considered the criminals of the world. But there is one thing that's stopping me from fully converting to the good guy Loki hypothesis, which is that he did say that the first thing he was going to do after being released would be to kill Luffy. And he didn't say this out loud. This was a thought, so I can't claim that he's acting on this one. And sure, it could be an exaggeration. In English, we do that all the time. It's a bit weird when you think about it, but saying that you're gonna kill someone is a fairly common way of describing how very upset you are with them. So look, it's not 100% yet, but with every chapter of Elbaph, it's looking like this Loki business is not as simple as it initially seemed. And in 2025, what we could be seeing is the redemption of Prince Loki. And thank you so much again to Fume for sponsoring this video. Definitely check them out through the link in the description.